Chapter 14 of Love Eternal by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michele Eaton. Together. On the afternoon of the first day after his arrival at the Abbey, some spirit in his feet moved Godfrey to go into the church. As though by instinct, he went to the chancel and stood there contemplating the brass of the nameless Plantagenet lady. How long it was since he had looked upon her graven face and form draped in the stately habiliments of a bygone age. Then he remembered with a pang Isobel was with him, and they had seemed to be very near together. Now there was no Isobel, and they were very far apart, both in the spirit and in the flesh. For he had not heard of her return to England, and imagined that she was still in Mexico, whence no tidings of her came to him. There he stood among the dead, reflecting that we do not need to pass out of the body to know the meaning of death, since, as once Isobel had said herself, some separations are as bad or worse. The story of the dead is, at any rate, completed. There is nothing more to be learned about them, and of them we imagine, perhaps quite erroneously, that we have had no need to be jealous, since we cannot conceive that they may form new interests in another sphere. But with the living it is otherwise. Somewhere their life is continued. Somewhere they are getting themselves friends or lovers, and carrying on the daily round of being, and we have no share in them, or in aught that they may do, and probably they have forgotten us, and if we still happen to be attached to them, oh, it hurts. Thus mused Godfrey, trying to picture to himself what Isobel looked like when she had stood by his side on that long past autumn eve, and only succeeded in remembering exactly what she looked like when she was kissing a rose with a certain knight in armour in a square garden, since for some perverse reason it was this picture that remained so painfully clear to his mind. Then he drifted off into speculations upon the general mystery of things of a sort that were common with him, and in these became oblivious of all else. He did not even hear or see a tall young woman enter the church, clad in summer white. No, not when she was within 5 pace, and becoming suddenly aware of his presence, had stopped to study him with the acutest interest. In a flash Isobel knew who he was. Of course he was much changed, for Godfrey, who had matured early, as those of his generation were apt to do, especially if they had led a varied life, was now a handsome and well-built young man, with a fine thoughtful face and a quite respectable moustache. How he has changed, oh, how he has changed, she thought to herself. The raw boy had become a man, and as she knew at once by her woman's instinct, a man with a great deal in him. Isobel was a sensible member of her sex, one, too, who had seen something of the world by now, and she did not expect or wish for a hero or a saint built upon the mid-Victorian pattern, as portrayed in the books of the lady novelists of that period. She wanted a man to be a man, by preference with the faults pertaining to the male nature, since she had observed that those who lacked these possessed others, which to her robust womanhood seemed far worse, such as meanness and avarice and backbiting, and all the other qualities of the Pharisee. Well, in Godfrey, whether she were right or wrong, with that swift glance of hers, she seemed to recognise a man as she wished a man to be. If that standard of hers meant that very possibly he had admired other women, the lady whom he had pulled up a precipice, for instance, she did not mind particularly, so long as he admired her, Isobel most of all. That was her one sine qua non, that he should admire her most of all, or rather be fondest of her in his innermost self. What was she thinking about? What was there to show that he cared one brass farthing about her? Nothing at all. And yet, Why was he here where she had parted from him so long ago? Surely not to stare at the grave of a dead woman with whom he could have nothing to do, since she left the world some 5 centuries before. And another question. What had brought her here, she who hated churches and all the mummery that they signified? Would he never wake up? Would he never realise her presence? Oh, then he could care nothing about her. Probably he was thinking of the girl he had pulled up a cliff in the Alps. But why did he come to this place to think of her? Isobel stood quite still there and waited in the shadow of a Georgian tomb, till presently Godfrey did seem to grow aware that he was no longer alone. Something or somebody had impinged upon his intelligence. He began to look about him, though always in the wrong direction. Then, convinced that he was the victim of fancy, he spoke aloud, as he had a habit of doing when by himself. "It's very curious," he said, "but I could have sworn that Isobel was here, as near me as when we parted. I suppose that is what comes of thinking so much about her. Or do people leave something of themselves behind in places where they have experienced emotion? If so, churches ought to be very full of ghosts. I dare say that they are. Only then no one could know it except those who had shared the emotion, and therefore they remain intangible. Still, I could have sworn that Isobel was here. Indeed, I seem to feel her now, and I hope that the dream will go on." Listening there in the shadow, she heard, and flushed in her flesh, and rejoiced in her innermost being. So he had not forgotten her, which is the true and real infidelity that never can be forgiven, at any rate by a woman. So she was still something in his life, although he had not answered her letter years ago. Then she grew angry with herself. What did it matter to her what he was, or thought, or did? It was absurd that she could be dependent morally upon anyone, who must rely in life or death upon herself alone, and on the strong soul within her. She was wroth with Godfrey for exciting such disturbance in, what was it, her spirit or her body? Nonsense, she had no spirit. That was a fantasy. Therefore it must be in her body, which was her own particular property, that should remain uninfluenced by any other body. So it came about the first words she spoke to him were somewhat rough in their texture. She stepped forward out of the shadow of the Georgian tomb, and confronted him with a defiant air, her head thrown back, looking, to tell the truth, rather stately. "I hoped that by this time you had given up talking to yourself, Godfrey, which, as I always told you, is a bad habit. I did not hear much of what you were mumbling, but I understood you to say that you thought I was here. Well, why shouldn't I be here?" He stared at her blankly and answered, "God knows, I don't. But since you ask the question, why are you here, Isobel?" "It is Isobel, isn't it? Or am I still dreaming? Let me touch you and I shall know." She drew back a little way, quite 3 inches. "Of course it is Isobel. Don't your senses tell you that without wanting to touch me? Why, I knew it was you from the end of the church. But you ask me why I am here? I wish you would tell me. I was passing, and something drew me into this place. I suppose it was you, and if so, I say at once that I resent it. You have no right." "No, no, certainly not. But do let me touch you to make sure that you are Isobel." "Very well," she said, and stretched out a hand towards him. He caught it with his left, which was nearest, and then with his right hand reached forward and seized her other hand. With a masterful movement he drew her towards him, and though she was a strong woman, she seemed to have no power to resist. She thought that he was going to kiss her, and did not care greatly if he did. But he checked himself in time, and instead of pressing his lips upon hers, only kissed her hands, first one and then the other, for quite a long while. Nor did she attempt to deny him, perhaps because a wild impulse took possession of her to kiss his in answer. Yes, his hands, or his lips, or even his coat or anything about him. Oh, it made her very angry, but there it was, for something rushed up in her which she had never felt before, something mad and wild and sweet. She wrenched herself away at last, and began to scold him again. "What have you been doing all these years? Why did you never write to me?" "Because I was too proud, as you never wrote to me." "Too proud? Pride will be your ruin. It goes before every sort of fall. Besides, I did write to you. I can show you a copy of the letter, if I haven't torn it up. I never got it." "Did you post it yourself?" "Yes. That is, I took it to the Abbey House, and left it to be addressed there." "Oh, then perhaps it is there still," and he looked at her. "Nonsense. No one could have been so mean, not even—" He shrugged his shoulders, a trick he had learned abroad, then said, "Well, it doesn't matter now, does it, Isobel?" "Yes, it matters a lot. Years of misunderstanding and doubt and loss, when life is so short. I might have married, or all sorts of things." "What has my not receiving your letter got to do with that?" he asked, astonished. "Nothing at all. Why do you ask such silly questions? I only meant that if I had married, I should not have been here, and we should never have met again." "Well, you are here, and we have met in this church where we parted." "Yes, it's odd, isn't it? I wish it had been somewhere else. I don't like this gloomy old place, with its atmosphere of death. Come outside." They went, and when they were through the churchyard gates, walked at hazard towards the stream which ran through the grounds of Hawks Hall. Here they sat down upon a fallen willow, watching the swallows skim over the surface of the placid waters, and for a while were silent. They had so much to say to each other that it seemed as though scarcely they knew where to commence. "Tell me," she said at length, "were you in the square garden on the night of the dance at which I came out?" "Oh, I see by your look that you were." "Then why did you not speak to me instead of standing behind a bush, watching in that mean fashion?" "I wasn't properly dressed for parties, and you seemed to be very much engaged with a rose and a knight in armour." "Engaged? It was only part of a game. I wrote and told you all about it in the letter you did not get. Did you never kiss a flower for a joke, and give it to someone, not knowing that you were being watched?" Godfrey coloured and shifted uneasily on his log. "Well, as a matter of fact," he said, "it is odd that you should have guessed, for something of that sort did once happen quite by accident. Also, I was watched." "I? You mean we. One doesn't kiss flowers by oneself and give them to the air. It would be more ridiculous even than the other thing." "I will tell you all about it if you like," he stammered confusedly. She looked at him with her large steady grey eyes, and answered in a cold voice, "No, thank you, I don't like. Nothing bores me so much as other people's silly love affairs." Baffled in defence, Godfrey resorted to attack. "What has become of the knight in armour?" he asked. "He is married and has twins. I saw the announcement of their birth in the paper yesterday." "And what has become of the lady with the flower? For since there was a flower, there must have been a lady. I suppose the same whom you pulled up the precipice." "She is married also to her cousin, but I don't know that she has any children yet, and I never pulled her up any precipice. It was a man I pulled, a very heavy one. My arm isn't quite right yet." "Oh," said Isobel. Then with another sudden change of voice she went on, "Now tell me all about yourself, Godfrey. There must be such lots to say, and I long to hear." So he told her, and she told him of herself, and they talked and talked till the shadows of advancing night began to close around them. Suddenly Godfrey looked at his watch, of which he could only just see the hands. "My goodness," he said, "it is 7:30. "Well, what about it? It doesn't matter when I dine, for I have come down alone here for a few days, a week perhaps, to get the house ready for my father and his friends." Yes, but my father dines at 7, and if there is one thing he hates, it is being kept waiting for dinner. She looked as though she thought that it did not matter much whether or not Mr. Knight waited for his dinner, then said, "Well, you can come up to the hall and dine with me." "I think I had better not," he answered. "You see, we are getting on so well together, I mean my father and I don't want to begin a row again. He would hate it." "You mean, Godfrey, that he would hate your dining with me? Well, that is true, for he always loathed me like poison, and I don't think he is a man to change his mind. So perhaps you had better go. Do you think we shall be allowed to see each other again?" she added with sarcasm. "Of course. Let's meet here to-morrow at 11. My father is going to a diocesan meeting and won't be back till the evening, so we might spend the day together if you have nothing better to do." "Let me see. No, I have no engagement. You see, I only came down half an hour before we met in the church." Then they rose from their willow log and stood looking at each other, a very proper pair. Something welled up in him and burst from his lips. "How beautiful you have grown," he said. She laughed a little, very softly, and said, "Beautiful? Aye, those alpine snows affect the sight, don't they? I felt like that on Popocatepetl. Or is it the twilight that I have to thank?" "Oh, you silly old Godfrey, you must have been living among very plain people." "You are beautiful," he replied stubbornly. "The most beautiful woman I ever saw. You always were, and you always will be." Again she laughed, for who of her sex is there that does not like to be called beautiful, especially when she knows that it is meant, and that whatever her personal shortcomings, to the speaker she is beautiful. But this time the only answer she attempted was, "You said you were late, and you are getting later. Run home, there's a good little boy." "Why do you laugh at me?" he asked. "Because I am laughing at myself," she answered, "and you should have your share." Then very nearly he kissed her, only he was in such a hurry. Also the willow log, a large one, was between them. Possibly she had arranged that this should be so. So he could only press her hand and depart, muttering something indistinguishable. She watched him vanish, after which she sat down again on the log and really did laugh. Still, it was a queer kind of merriment, for by degrees it turned into little sobs and tears. "You little fool, what has happened to you?" she asked herself. Are you, and if so, is he? Oh, nonsense, and yet something has happened, for I never felt like this before. I thought it was all rubbish, mere natural attraction, part of nature's scheme and so on, as they write in the clever books. But it's more than that. At least it would be if I were. Besides, I'm ages older than he is, although I was born 6 months later. I'm a woman full grown, and he is only a boy. If he hadn't been a boy, he would have taken his advantage when he must have known that I was weak as water, just for the joy of seeing him again. Now he has lost his chance, if he wanted one, for by tomorrow I shall be strong again, and there shall be no more." Then she looked at the backs of her hands, which she could not see because of the gathering darkness, and as they were invisible, kissed them instead, just as though they belonged to someone else. After this, she sat a while brooding and listening to the pulsing of her heart, which was beating with unusual strength this night. As she did so, in that mysterious hour which sometimes comes to us in English summers, a great change fell upon her. When she sat down upon that fallen tree, she was still a girl and virginal. When she rose from it, she was a developed, loving woman. It was as though a spirit had visited her and whispered in her ear. She could almost hear the words. They were, "Fulfil your fate, love and be loved with body and with spirit, with heart and soul and strength." At length she rose, and as she did so, said aloud, "I do not know who or what I have to thank for life, and all that makes me me. But I am glad to have been born now, who have often wished that I have never been born. Even if I knew that I must pass away tonight, I should still be glad, since I have learned that there is something in me which cannot die. It came when that man kissed my hands, and it will endure forever. Godfrey was late for dinner, very late, and what was worse, his father had waited for him. I suppose you forgot that I dined at 7, not at 8, was his cold greeting. For Mr. Knight, a large eater like many teetotalers, was one of those people who make a fetish of punctuality at meals, and always grow cross when they are hungry. Godfrey, whose mind had not been steadied by the events of the afternoon, became confused and replied that he was extremely sorry, but the fact was he had met Isobel, and in talking to her had not noticed the time. "Isobel!" exclaimed his father, whose voice was now icy. "What Isobel? I never knew but one, father." "Oh, I suppose you mean Miss Blake. I had no idea she was here. Indeed, I thought she was still in Mexico, but doubtless you were better informed." "No, father, I met her accidentally. She has returned to England." "That is obvious, Godfrey." "She has come down," he continued in a hurry, "to get the house ready for Sir John, who arrives shortly." "Oh, has she? What a strange coincidence! All the years of our separation while you were away, she was away, but within 2 days of your return she returns." "Yes, it does seem odd," agreed the flustered Godfrey. "But it's lucky, isn't it? For of course I am glad to see her again." Mr. Knight finished carving himself a helping of beef, and let the knife fall with a clatter into the dish. Then he said in carefully chosen words, "You may think it lucky or well arranged, but I must differ. I tell you at once that I consider Miss Blake a most pernicious young woman, and as your father I can only express the hope that you do not intend to allow her to reassert her evil influence over you." Godfrey was about to answer with wrath, but changed his mind and remained silent. So the topic dropped, but that it stood very straight upon its feet in Mr. Knight's mind was clear from the compression of his thin lips and the ill humour of his remarks about the coldness and overdone character of the beef, and sundry other household matters. As soon as the meal was concluded, and he had washed it down with the last glass of water, and with a very wry face thanked Providence for all that he had received, he retired into his study, and was seen no more till prayer time. Nor was he seen then by Godfrey, who had gone out to smoke his pipe, since his father could not bear the smell of tobacco in the house, and wandered unconsciously towards the hall. There he stood gazing at a light which he knew came from Isobel's window, and lost in this unfruitful contemplation, once more forgot the time. When he arrived home, it was to find the house in darkness, and a note in his father's handwriting on the hall table, requesting him to be careful to lock the door, as every one had gone to bed. He went too, but could not sleep, for strangely enough, that disturbance of body and spirit which had afflicted Isobel possessed him also. It seemed wonderful to him that he should have found her again, whom he thought to be so utterly lost, and grown so sweet and dear. How could he have lived all this while without her, he wondered, and another thought, how could he bear to part with her once more? Oh, she was his life, and why should they part? She had not minded when he kissed her hands, at which of course she might have been angry. Indeed, she left them to be kissed for quite a long while, though not half long enough. Perhaps she did not wish that they should part either, or perhaps she only desired that they should be just friends as before. It seemed almost impossible that they could become more than friends, even if she cared to do so, which he could scarcely hope. What was he, a young fellow, 20, with only a little money, and all his way to make in the world? And what was she, a grand young lady, rather younger than himself, it was true, but seeming years older, who was a great heiress, they said, and expected to marry a lord, someone born with a silver spoon in his mouth, whose fortune had been made for him by other people. Moreover, his father hated her because their religious views were different, and her father hated him, or used to, for other reasons. Yes, it was quite impossible, and yet nature seemed to take no account of that. Nature seemed to tell him that it was absolutely possible, and indeed right, and what she, nature, wished. Also, this same persistent nature seemed to suggest to him that Isobel was her most willing and obedient pupil, and that perhaps if he could look into her heart, he would find that she did care, and very much more than for the wealth and hypothetical lord. Nature seemed to suggest, too, that Isobel's thoughts were with him at that moment, that she was uncommonly near to him in soul if not in body, that she was thinking about him as he was thinking about her, and saying much the same things to herself as he was saying to himself. Indeed, he even began a whispered conversation with her, of a sort he would not have ventured upon had she been there, pausing between the sentences for her answers, which, as he imagined them, were very satisfactory indeed. By degrees, however, question and answer grew less frequent and further apart, as he dozed off and finally sank into a deep sleep. So deep was it indeed that he was awakened only by the clamour of the breakfast bell, and when he arrived downstairs to be confronted by some cold bacon on an uncovered dish. His father had departed to the diocesan conference. Well, this fact had its consolations, and bacon, however cold, with contentment is better than bacon hot where contention is. So he ate it and anything else he could find with appetite, and then went upstairs to shave and do his hair nicely, and to put on a new suit of clothes, which he considered became him. Also, as he had still 3/4 of an hour to spare, he began to write a little poem about Isobel, which was a dismal failure, to tell the truth, since he could think of no satisfactory rhyme to her name except "Oh well," which, however he put it, sounded silly. At last, rather too early, he threw the sheet of paper into the fireplace and started, only to find that although it still lacked 1/4 of an hour to 11, Isobel was already seated on that tree. "What have you been doing to yourself?" she asked, putting on those smart London clothes. "I like the old grey things you had on last night ever so much better, and I wanted you to climb a tree to get me some young jackdaws. And good gracious, Godfrey, your head smells like a whole hairdresser's shop. Please come to the other side, to leeward of me." He murmured something about liking to look tidy, and then remarked that she seemed rather finely dressed herself. "It's only my Mexican hat," she answered, touching the big sombrero, woven from the finest Panama grass, which she was wearing, and the necklace is made of little gold Aztec idols that were found in a grave. They are very rare. A gentleman gave them to me, and afterwards I was horrified to find that he had paid an awful lot for them, £200, I believe. Do you understand about the Aztec gods? If not, I will explain them all to you. This big one in the middle is Huitzilopochtli, the god of—" "No, no," interrupted Godfrey. I don't want to. I think them very ugly, and I always understood that ladies did not accept such expensive presents from gentlemen. Who was he?" "An American millionaire who didn't wear armour," she answered blandly. Then she changed the subject with the original remark that the swallows were flying higher than they had done on the previous evening, when they looked as though one could almost catch them with one's hand. Godfrey reflected to himself that other things which had seemed quite close on the previous night were now like the swallows far out of reach. Only he took comfort in the remembrance that swallows, however near, are evasive birds, not easy to seize unless you can find them sleeping. Next she began to tell him all about the Mexican gods, whether he wanted to listen or not, and he sat there in the glory of his new clothes and brilliantined hair, and gazed at her till she asked him to desist, as she felt as though she were being mesmerised. This led him to his spiritualistic experiences, of which he told her all the story, and by the time it was finished, behold, it was the luncheon hour. "It is very interesting," she said as they entered the hall, "and I can't laugh at it all as I should have done once. I don't quite know why, but I hope, Godfrey, that you will have no more to do with spirits." "No, not while," and he looked at her. "While what?" "While there are such nice bodies in the world," he stammered, colouring. She coloured also, tossed her head, and went to wash her hands. The afternoon they spent in hunting for imaginary young jackdaws in a totally nebulous tree. Isobel grew rather cross over its non-discovery, swearing that she remembered it well years ago, and that there were always young jackdaws there. "Perhaps it has been cut down," suggested Godfrey. "I am told that your father has been improving the place a great deal in that kind of way, so as to make it up to date and scientific and profitable, and all the rest of it. Also, if it hasn't, there would have been no young jackdaws, since they must have flown quite 6 weeks ago." "Then why couldn't you say that at once, instead of making us waste all this time?" asked Isobel with indignation. "I don't know," replied Godfrey, in a somewhat vacuous fashion. "It was all the same to me if we were hunting for young jackdaws or the man in the moon, as long as we're together. Godfrey, it is evident that you have been overworking and are growing foolish. I make excuses for you, since anybody who passed first out of Sandhurst must have overworked, but it does not alter the fact. Now I must go home and see about that house, for as yet I have arranged nothing at all, and the place is in an awful state. Remember that my father is coming down presently with either 6 or 8 terrible people, I forget which. All I know about them is that they are extremely rich and expect to be what is called done well." "Must you?" remarked Godfrey, looking disappointed. "Yes, I must, and so must you. Your father is coming back by the 5 o'clock train, and I advise you to be there to meet him. Perhaps I shall see you to-morrow sometime." "I can't," exclaimed Godfrey in a kind of wail. "I am to be taken off to a school in some town or other, I forget which, that my father has been examining. I suppose it is the speech day, and he proposes to introduce me as a kind of object lesson, because I have passed first in an examination. Yes, as a shining example, and an advertisement. Well, perhaps we shall meet later." And without giving him an opportunity of saying more, she vanished away. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Love Eternal by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michele Eaton. Forever. Godfrey managed to be late again, and only reached home 5 minutes after his father, who had bicycled instead of walking from the station, as he supposed that he would do. "I forgot to give orders about your lunch," said Mr. Knight tentatively. "I hope that you managed to get some." "Oh yes, father. That is, I lunched out at the Hall." "Indeed, I did not know that Sir John had arrived." "No, he hasn't. At least I have not seen him. I lunched with Isobel." "Indeed," remarked Mr. Knight again, and the subject dropped. Next day Godfrey, once more arrayed in his best clothes, attended the prize-giving, and Julie was made to look foolish, only getting home just in time for dinner, after which his father requested him to check certain examination papers. Then came Sunday and church, at which Isobel did not appear. 2 churches, in fact, and after these a tea-party to the churchwardens and their wives, to whom Godfrey was expected to explain the wonders of the Alps. Before it was over, if he could have managed it, these stolid farmers with their families would have lain at the bottom of the deepest moraine that exists amid those famous mountains. But there they were, swallowing tea and munching cake, while they gazed on him with ox-like eyes, and he plunged into wild explanations as to the movements of glaciers. "Something like one of them new-fangled machines what carry hay up on the top of the stacks," said Churchwarden number 1 at length. "Did you ever sit on a glacier while it glided from the top to the bottom of a mountain, Master Godfrey? And if so, however did you get up again?" asked Churchwarden number 2. "Is a glacier so called after the tradesman what cuts glass, because glass and ice are both clear like?" inquired Churchwarden number 1, filled with sudden inspiration. Then Godfrey, in despair, said that he thought it was, and fled away, only to be reproached afterwards by his father for having tried to puzzle those excellent and pious men. On Monday his luck was better, since Mr. Knight was called away immediately after lunch to take a funeral in a distant parish, of which the incumbent was absent at the seaside. Godfrey, by a kind of instinct, sped at once to the willow log by the stream, where, through an outreaching of the long arm of coincidence, he found Isobel seated. After casually remarking that the swallows were flying neither high nor low that day, but as it were in mid-air, she added that she had not seen him for a long while. "No, you haven't, say for 3 years," he answered, and detailed his tribulations. "Ah," said Isobel, "that's always the way. One is never left at leisure to follow one's own fancies in this world. To-morrow, for instance, my father and all his horrible friends, I don't know any of them except one, but from past experience I presume them to be horrible, are coming down to lunch, and are going to stop for 3 days partridge shooting. Their female belongings are going to stop also, or some of them are, which means I shall have to look after them." "It's all bad news to-day," remarked Godfrey, shaking his head. "I've just had a telegram saying that I must report myself on Wednesday. Goodness knows why, for I expected to get a month's leave." "Oh," said Isobel, looking a little dismayed. "Then let us make the best of to-day, for who knows what to-morrow may bring forth." Who indeed? Certainly not either of these young people. They talked a while seated by the river, then began to walk through certain ancient grazing grounds where the monks used to run their cattle. Their conversation, fluent enough at first, grew somewhat constrained and artificial, since both of them were thinking of matters different from those that they were trying to dress out in words. Intimate, pressing, burning matters that seemed to devour their intelligences of every day with a kind of eating fire. They grew almost silent, talking only at random, and listening to the beating of their own hearts rather than to the words that fell from each other's lips. The sky clouded over, and some heavy drops of rain began to fall. "I suppose that we must go in," said Isobel. "We shall be soaked presently," and she glanced at her light summer attire. "Where?" exclaimed Godfrey. "The Abbey?" "No, my father will be back by now. It must be the Hall." "Very well, but I dare say my father is there by now, for I understand that he is coming down this afternoon to arrange about the shooting." "Great heavens!" groaned Godfrey. "And I wanted to tell you a story which I thought perhaps might interest you, and I don't know when I shall get another chance now." "Then why did you not tell your story before?" she inquired with some irritation. "Oh, because I have only just thought of it," he replied rather wildly. At this moment they were passing the church, and the rain began to fall in earnest. By some mutual impulse they entered through the chancel door, which was always unlocked, and by some mutual folly left it open. Advancing instinctively to the tombs of the unknown Plantagenet lady and her knight, which were so intimately connected with the little events of their little lives, they listened for a while to the rush of the rain upon the leaden roof, saying nothing, till the silence grew irksome indeed. Each waited for the other to break it, but with a woman's infinite patience, Isobel waited the longer. There she stood, staring at the brass of the Plantagenet lady, still as the bones of that lady which lay beneath. "My story," said Godfrey at last with a gasp, and stopped. "Yes," said Isobel. "What is it?" "Oh," he exclaimed in an agony, "a very short one. I love you, that's all." A little quiver ran through her, causing her dress to shake and the gold Mexican gods on her necklace to tinkle against each other. Then she grew still as a stone, and raising those large and steady eyes of hers, looked him up and down, finally fixing them upon his own. "Is that true?" she asked. "True? It is as true as life and death, or as heaven and hell." "I don't know anything about heaven and hell. They are hypothetical, are they not? Life and death are enough for me." And she stopped. "Then by life and death, for life and death, and forever, I love you, Isobel." "Thank you," she said, and stopped once more. "You don't help one much. Have you nothing to say?" "What is there to say? You made a statement for which I thanked you. You asked no question." "It is a question," he exclaimed indignantly. "If I love you, of course I want to know if you love me." "Then why did you not say so? But," she added very deliberately, "since you want to know, I do and always have and always shall, in life or death, and for ever, if that means anything." He stared at her, tried to utter something and failed. Then he fell back upon another very primitive and ancient expedient. Flinging his arms about her, he pressed her to his heart and kissed her again and again and again. Nor in her moment of complete surrender did she scruple to kiss him back. It was while they were thus engaged, offering a wonderful spectacle of love triumphant, and rejoicing in its triumph, that another person, who was passing the church, bethought him of its shelter as a refuge from the pouring rain. Seeing the open door, Mr. Knight, for it was he, slipped into the great building in his quiet, rather cat-like fashion, but on its threshold saw and stopped. Notwithstanding the shadows, he recognised them in a moment. More, the sight of this pair, the son whom he disliked and the woman whom he hated, thus embraced, thus lost in a sea of passion, moved him to white fury, so that he lifted his clenched hands above his head and shook them, muttering, "And in my church, my church!" Then, unable to bear more of this spectacle, he slipped away again, heedless of the pouring skies. By nature, although in obedience to a rash promise once he had married, Mr. Knight was a true woman-hater. That sex and everything to do with it were repellent to him. Even the most harmless manifestations of natural affection between male and female he considered disgusting, indeed indecent, and if these were carried any further, he held it to be among the greatest of crimes. He was one of those who, if he had the power, would have hounded any poor girl, who in the country phrase had got into trouble, to the river brink and over it, as a creature not fit to live, or if she escaped destruction, would have, and indeed often had, pursued her with unceasing malignity, thinking that thereby he did God service. His attitude towards such a person was that of an inquisitor towards a fallen nun. Moreover, he could do this with a clear conscience, since he could truly say that he was qualified to throw the first stone, being of those who mistake personal aversion for personal virtue. Because his cold-hearted nature rejected it, he loathed this kind of human failing, and felt good in the loathing. Nor did it ever occur to him to reflect that others, such as secret malice, jealousy, and all uncharitableness on which his heart fed, might be much worse than the outrush of human passion, in obedience to the almighty decree of nature that is determined not to die. These being his views, the feelings that the sight awoke in him of this pair, declaring their holy love in the accustomed human fashion, can scarcely be measured, and are certainly beyond description. Had he been another sort of man, who had found some devil flogging a child to death, the rage and indignation aroused in his breast could not have been greater, even if it were his own child. The one thing that Mr. Knight had feared for years was that Godfrey, who, as he knew, was fonder of Isobel than of any other living creature, should come to love her in a fuller fashion. Isobel, a girl who had laughed at and flouted him, and once told him to his face that a study of his character and treatment of others had done more to turn her from the Christian religion than anything else. In a sense, he was unselfish in this matter, or rather his hate mastered her selfishness. He knew very well that Isobel would be a great match for Godfrey, and he was by no means a man who underrated money and position and their power. He guessed, too, that she really loved him and would have made him the best of wives, that with her at his side he might do almost anything in the world. But these considerations did not in the least soften his loathing of the very thought of such a marriage. Incredible as it may seem, he would rather have seen Godfrey dead than the happy husband of Isobel. Mr. Knight, drunk with rage, reeled rather than walked away from the church door, wondering what he might do to baulk and shame that living, loving pair who could kiss and cling even among the tombs. A thought came to him, a very evil thought, which he welcomed as an inspiration sent straight from an offended heaven. Sir John Blake had come home. He knew it, for he had passed him on the road seated alone in a fine motor car, and they had waved their hands to each other not 10 minutes before. He would go and tell him all, in the character of an upright man who does not like to see his rich neighbour harmed by the entanglement of that neighbour's daughter in an undesirable relationship. That Sir John would consider himself to be harmed, he was sure enough, being by no means ignorant of his plans and aspirations for the future of that daughter, who was expected to make a great alliance in return for the fortune which she would bring to her husband. No sooner said than done. In 3 minutes he was at the hall, and, as it chanced, met Sir John by the door. "Hello, Reverend, how are you? You look very wet and miserable. Taking refuge from the rain, I suppose, though it is clearing off now. Have a brandy and soda or a glass of port?" "Thank you, Sir John. I am an abstainer, but a cup of hot tea would be welcome." "Tea? Ah, yes, but that takes time to make, so I should have to leave you to drink it by yourself. Fact is, I want to find my daughter. Some of those blessed guests of mine, including Mountjoy, the young Earl, you know, whom I wish her to meet particularly, are coming down tonight by the last train, and not tomorrow, so I must get everything arranged in a hurry. Can't make out where the girl has gone." "I think I can tell you, Sir John," said Mr. Knight with a sickly smile. "At least I saw her a little while ago, rather peculiarly engaged." "Where and how was she engaged?" Without asking permission, Mr. Knight entered the house and stepped into a cloak-room that opened out of the hall. Being curious, Sir John followed him. Mr. Knight shut the door, and supporting himself against the frame of a marble wash-basin with gilded taps, said, "I saw her in the chancel of the Abbey church, and she was kissing my son Godfrey. At least he was kissing her, and she seemed to be responding to his infamous advances, for her arms were round his neck, and I heard sounds which suggested that this was so." "Holy Moses!" ejaculated Sir John. "What in the name of hell are they after?" "Your question, stripped of its unnecessary and profane expletives, seems easy to answer. I imagine that my immoral son has just proposed to your daughter and been accepted with, well, usual emphasis. Perhaps you are right, but if he had, I don't see anything particularly immoral about it. If I had never done anything worse than that, I should feel myself called to go upon my knees and cry peccavi. However, that ain't the point. The point is that a game of this sort don't at all suit my book. But, here he looked at the clergyman shrewdly, why do you come to tell about it? I should have thought that under the circumstances you should have been glad. Isobel isn't likely to be exactly a beggar, you know, so it seems devilish queer that you should object, as I gather you do, unless it is to the kissing, which has been heard of before. I do object most strongly, Sir John, replied Mr. Knight in his iciest tones. I disapprove entirely of your daughter, whose lack of any Christian feeling is notorious, and whose corrupting influence will, I fear, make my son as bad as herself. Damn her lack of Christian feeling, and damn yours and your impudence too, you half-drowned church rat. Why don't you call her Jezebel at once, and have done with it? One of the things I like about her is that she has the pluck to snap her fingers at such as you and all your ignorant superstitions. What are you getting at? That is what I want to know. I put aside your insults, to which as a clergyman 'tis my duty to turn the other cheek, replied Mr. Knight with a furious gasp. As to the rest, I am trying to get at the pure and sacred truth. You look as though you would do better to get at the pure and sacred brandy, remarked Sir John, surveying him critically, but that's your affair. Now, what is the truth? Alas, that I must say it. I believe my son to be the basest of creatures, a fortune hunter. How did he get that money left to him by another woman? Don't know, I'm sure. Perhaps the old girl found the young chap attractive, and wished to acknowledge favours received. Such things have been known. You don't suppose he forged her will, do you? You are ribald, Sir Ribald. Am I? Well, and you are jolly offensive. Thank God you weren't my father. Now, from what I remember of that boy of yours, I shouldn't have thought that he was a fortune hunter. I should have thought that he was a young beggar who wished to get hold of the girl he fancies, and that's all. Still, you know him best, and I dare say you are right. Anyway, for your own peculiar and crack-brained reasons, you don't want this business, and I say at once you can't want it less than I do. Do you suppose that I wish to see my only child, who will have 500,000 of money, and might be a countess, or 6 countesses, tomorrow married to the son of a beggarly sniveller like you? For as you are so fond of the pure and sacred truth, I'll give it you, a fellow who can come and peach upon your own boy and his girl. My conscience and my duty, began Mr. Knight. Oh, drat your conscience and blow your duty. You're a spy and a backbiting telltale, that's what you are. Did you never kiss a girl yourself? Never until after I was married, when we are specially enjoined by the great apostle. Then I'm sorry for your wife, for she must have had a lot to teach you. But let's stop slanging. We have our own opinions of each other, and there's an end. Now, we have both the same object. You because you are a pious crank, and no more human than a dried eel, and I because I am a man of the world, who want to see my daughter where she ought to be, wearing a coronet in the House of Lords. The question is, how is the job to be done? You don't understand Isobel, but I do. If her back is put up, wild horses won't move her. She'd snap her fingers in my face and tell me to go to a place that you are better acquainted with than I am, or will be, and take my money with me. Of course, I could hold her for a few months, till she is of age perhaps, but after that, no. So it seems that the only chance is your son. Now, what's his weak point? Can he be bought off?" "Certainly not," said Mr. Knight. "Oh, that's odd in one who you say is a fortune hunter. Well, what is it? Every one has a weak point, and another girl won't do just now." "His weakest point is his fondness for that treacherous and abominable sex of which I have just had so painful an example. And in the church too. Yes, in my church. And a jolly good place to get to in such a rain, for of course they didn't know that you were hiding under the pews. But I've told you that cock won't fight at present. What's the next?" At these accumulated insults, Mr. Knight turned perfectly livid with suppressed rage. But he did suppress it, for he had an object to gain, which to his perverted mind was the most important in the whole world, namely, the final separation of his son and Isobel. "His next bad point," he went on, in his pride, which is abnormal, although from childhood I have done my best to inculcate humility of spirit into his heart. "He cannot bear any affront or even neglect. For instance, he left me for some years just because he did not consider that he was received properly on his return from Switzerland. Also because he went into a rage, for he has a very evil temper if roused, when I suggested that he wanted to run after your daughter's money." Well, it wasn't a very nice thing to say, was it? But I think I see light. He's proud, is he, and don't like allusions to fortune hunting. All right, I'll rub his nose in the dirt and make him good. I'm just the boy for a job of that sort, as perhaps you will agree, my reverend friend, and if he shows his airs to me, I'll kick him off the premises. Come on, I dare say we shall find them still in the church, where they think themselves so snug, although the rain has stopped." So this precious pair started, each of them bent, though for different reasons, upon as evil a mission as the mind of man can conceive. For what is there more wicked than to wish to bring about the separation and subsequent misery of two young people, who, as they guessed well enough, loved each other body and soul, and thereby to spoil their lives? Yet so strange in human nature, that neither of them thought that they were committing any sin. Mr. Knight now and afterwards justified himself with the reflection that he was parting his son from a pernicious young woman of strong character, who would probably lead him away from religion as it was understood by him. One also whom he looked upon as the worst of outcasts, who deserved and doubtless was destined to inhabit hell, because hastily she had rejected his form of faith, as the young are apt to do, for reasons, however hollow, that seemed to her sufficient. He took no account of his bitter secret jealousy of this girl, who, as he thought, had estranged his son from him, and prevented him from carrying out his cherished plans of making of him a clergyman like himself, or of his innate physical hatred of women, which caused him to desire that Godfrey should remain celibate. These motives, although he was well aware of them, he set down as naught, being quite sure, in view of the goodness of his aims, that they would be overlooked, or even commended by the power above, whom he pictured in his mind's eye as a furious old man, animated chiefly by jealousy and a desire to wreak vengeance on and torture the helpless. For it is the lessons of the Old Testament that sink most deeply into the souls of Mr. Knight and his kind. Sir John's ends were quite different. He was the very vulgarest of self-made men, coarse and brutal by nature, a sensualist of the type that is untouched by imagination, a man who would crush anyone who stood in his path without compunction, just because that person did stand in his path. But he was extremely shrewd. Witness the way he saw through Mr. Knight, and in his own fashion very able. Witness his success in life. Moreover, since a man of his type had generally some object beyond the mere acquiring of money, particularly after it has been acquired, he had his to rise high, for he was very ambitious. His natural discernment set all his own failings before him in the clearest light, also their consequences. He knew that he was vulgar and brutal, and that as a result all persons of real gentility looked down upon him, however much they might seem to cringe before his money and power. Yes, though they chanced to be but labouring men. For instance, his wife had done so, which was one of the reasons why he hated her, as indeed had all her distinguished relatives after they came to know him, although he lent them money. He knew that even if he became a peer, as he fully expected to do, it would be the same story. Outward deference and lip service, but inward dislike and contempt. In short, there were limits which he could never hope to pass, and therefore, so far as he was concerned, his ambitious thirst must remain unslaked. But he had a daughter whom nature, perhaps because of her mother's blood, had set in quite a different class. She had his ability, but she was gentle born, which he was not. One who could mix with and be welcomed by the highest in the world, and this without the slightest question. If not beautiful, she was very distinguished. She had presence and what the French call the air. Further, she would be one of the richest women in England. Considered from his point of view, therefore, it was but natural that he should desire her to make a brilliant marriage and found a great family, which he would thus have originated, at any rate to some extent. Night and day he longed that this should come about, and it was the reason why the young Lord Mountjoy was visiting Hawks Hall. Mountjoy had met Isobel at a dinner party in London the other day, and admired her. He had told an old lady, a kind of society tout, who had repeated it to Sir John, that he wished to get married, and that Isobel Blake was the sort of girl he would like to marry. He was a clever man, also ambitious, one who had hopes of some day ruling the country, but to do this he needed behind him great and assured fortune in addition to his ancient but somewhat impoverished rank. In short, she suited his book, and he suited that of Sir John. Now the thing to do was to bring it about that he should also suit Isobel's book, and just at the critical moment this accursed accident had happened. Oh, it was too much. No wonder that Sir John was filled with righteous wrath and a stern determination to make things hot, for the cause of the accident, as led to the attack by the active but dripping Mr. Knight, whom he designated in his heart as that little cur of a parson, much as an overfed and bloated bloodhound might be by some black and vicious mongrel. He tramped heavily towards the church. Indeed, they made a queer contrast, this small, active, but fierce-faced man in his sombre, shiny garments and dingy white tie, and the huge, ample-paunched baronet with his red flat face, heavy lips, and projecting but intelligent eyes, clothed in a new suit, wearing an enormous black pearl in his necktie and a diamond ring on his finger, the very ideal of maman in every detail of his person and of his carefully advertised opulence. Isobel, whose humour had its sardonic side, and who was the first to catch sight of them when they reached the church, Mr. Knight tripping ahead, and Sir John hot with the exercise in the close, moist air, lumbering after him with his mouth open, compared them in her mind to a fierce little pilot fish conducting an overfed shark to some helpless prey which it had discovered battling with the waters of circumstance. That, after all, was only another version of the mongrel and the bloodhound. Also she compared them to other things even less complimentary. Yet none of these perhaps was really adequate, either to the evil intentions or the repellent appearance of this pair as they advanced upon their wicked mission of jealousy and hate. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Love Eternal by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michele Eaton. Love and Loss. All unaware that they had been seen and by no friendly eyes, Godfrey and Isobel remained embracing each other for quite a long while. At length she wrenched herself away, and sinking on to the chancel bench, motioned to him to seat himself beside her. "Let us talk," she said in a new voice, a strange voice that was low and rich, such as he had never heard her use. "Let us talk, my dear." "What of?" he asked, almost in a whisper, as he took his place, and her hand, which he held against his beating heart. "My soul has been talking to yours for the last 5 minutes. Or is it 5 seconds, or 5 years? It does not seem to have anything more to say. Yet I think there is plenty to be said, Godfrey. Do you know that while we were kissing each other, there was some very queer ideas got hold of me, not only of the sort which might be expected in our case. You remember that Plantagenet lady who lies buried beneath where we are standing, she whose dress I once copied to wear at the ball when I came out?" "Don't speak of that," he interrupted, "for then you were kissing someone else." "It is not true. I never kissed anyone else in that way, and I do not think I ever shall. I kissed a rose, that's all, and I gather that you have done as much, and very likely a great deal more. But it is of the lady I am speaking, not of the ball. She seemed to come up from her grave and enter into me and say something." "Well, what did she say, Isobel?" he asked dreamily. "That's it. I don't know, although she talked to me as one might to oneself. All I know is that it was of trouble and patience and great joy and war and tragedy in which I must be intimately concerned, and, after the tragedy, of a most infinite rest and bliss." "I expect she was telling you her own story, which seems to have ended well," he replied in the same dreamy fashion. "Yes, I think so, but also that she meant that her story would be my story, copied, you know, as I copied her dress. Of course it is all nonsense, just the influence of the place taking hold of me when overcome by other things, but at the time it seemed very real." "So does a bad dream," said Godfrey, "but for all that it isn't real. Still, it is odd that everything important seems to happen to us within a few feet of that lady's dust, and I can't quite disbelieve in spirits and their power of impressing themselves upon us. I wish I could. The strange thing is that you should put any faith in them. I don't, though I admit that my views about such matters are changing. You know I used to be sure that when we die everything is over with us. Now I think differently. Why, I cannot say." Then the subject dropped, because really they were both wrapped in the great joy of a glorious hour, and disinclined to dwell upon fancies about a woman who had died 500 years ago, or on metaphysical speculations. Also the fear of what might follow upon that hour haunted them more vividly than any hovering ghost, if such there were. "My dear," said Isobel, "I am sorry, but I must say it. I am sure that there will be trouble about this business." "No doubt, Isobel, there always is trouble, at least where I am concerned. Also, one can't be happy without paying. But what does it matter so long as we stick to each other? Soon we shall both be of age and can do what we like." "One always thinks that, Godfrey, and yet somehow one never can. Free will is a fraud in that sense as in every other. I have something, as you know, enough with my pay to enable us to get on, even if you were disinherited, dear, though of course you could not live as you have been accustomed to." "Oh, don't talk to me of money," she said impatiently, "though for the matter of that I have something too, a little that comes to me from my mother. Money won't divide us, Godfrey." "Then what will, Isobel?" "Nothing in the long run," she answered with conviction, "not even death itself, since in a way we are one, and part of each other, and therefore cannot be separated for always. Whatever happens for a while, as I am sure that something will happen which will make you leave me, I swear that I will never leave you. I will die with you first, he exclaimed, springing up. Such oaths have been made often and broken before the dawn, she answered, smiling and shaking her head. I swear that I will always love you, he went on. Ah, now I believe you, dear, she broke in again. However badly you may behave, you will always love me because you must. Well, and will you always love me however badly I behave? Of course, she answered simply, because I must. Oh, whatever we may hear about each other, we may be quite certain that we will still love each other, because we must, and all your heaven and hell cannot make any difference. No, not if they were both to join forces and try their best. But that does not mean that necessarily we shall marry each other, for I think that people who love like that rarely do marry, because, you see, they would be too happy, which something is always trying to prevent. It may mean, however, she added reflectively, that we shall not marry anybody else, though even that might happen in your case, not in mine. Always remember, Godfrey, that I shall never marry anybody else, not even if you took 3 wives, one after the other. 3 wives? Gasped Godfrey. Yes, why not? It would be quite natural, wouldn't it, if you wouldn't marry me, and even proper. Only I should never take one. Husband, I mean, not from any particular virtue, but just because I couldn't. You see, it would make me ill, and if I tried, I should only run away. Oh, stop talking nonsense, said Godfrey, when so soon you will have to go to see about those people, and he held out his arms. She sank into them, and for a little while they forgot their doubts and fears. The rain had ceased, and the triumphant sun, shining gloriously through the west window of stained glass, poured its rays upon them, dyeing them all the colours of an angel's wings. Also, incidentally, it made them extremely conspicuous in that dusky church, of which they had all this while forgotten to shut the door. My word, said Sir John to Mr. Knight, in tones of savage sarcasm, as they surveyed the two through this door. We've got here just at the right time. Don't they look pretty? And don't you wish that you were his age, and that was someone else's daughter? I tell you I do. Mr. Knight gurgled something in his inarticulate wrath, for at that moment he hated Isabel's father as much as he did Isabel, which was saying a great deal. Well, my pretty pair of cooing turtle-doves, went on Sir John in a sort of shout, addressing himself to them. Be so good as to stop that, or I think I shall wring both your necks, damn you. Not in this holy house, which these infamous and shameless persons have desecrated with their profane embraces, interrupted Mr. Knight. Yes, according to your ideas, it will be almost a case of reconsecration. You'll have to write to the bishop about it, Mr. Parson. Oh, confound you. Don't stand there like a couple of stuck pigs, but come out of that and let us have a little chat in the churchyard. Now, at the first words that reached their ears, Godfrey and Isobel had drawn back from each other and stood side by side, quite still before the altar, as a pair about to be married might do. They were dumbfounded, and no wonder. As might be expected, Isobel was the first to recover herself. Come, my dear, she said in a clear voice to Godfrey. My father and yours wish to speak to us. I am glad we have a chance of explaining matters so soon. Yes, said Godfrey, but in a wrathful voice, for he felt anger stirring in him. Perhaps it was excited by that ancient instinct which causes the male animal to resent the spying upon him when he is courting his female as the deadliest of all possible insults, or perhaps by some prescience of affronts which were about to be offered to him and Isobel by these two whom he knew to be bitterly hostile. At least his temper was rising, and like most rather gentle-natured men, when really provoked and cornered, he could be dangerous. Yes, he repeated, let us go out and see this matter through. So they went, Sir John and Mr. Knight drawing back a little before them, till they were brought to a halt by the horrible memorial which the former had erected over his wife's grave. Here they stood, prepared for the encounter. Sir John was the first to take the lists, saying, "Perhaps you will explain, Isobel, why I found you, as I thought, kissing this young fellow, like any village slut beneath a hedge." Isobel's big eyes grew steely as she answered, "For the same reason, father, like your village slut. I kiss this man because he is my lover, whom I mean to marry. If, as I gather, you are not certain as to what you saw, I will kiss him again here in front of you." "I have no doubt you will, just like your cheek," ejaculated Sir John, taken a little aback. Then Mr. Knight took up the ball, addressing himself to his son. "Could you find no other place for your immoral performances except the church, Godfrey, and my chancel too?" "No," answered Godfrey, "because it was raining, and we sheltered there." "And what do you mean by your talk about immorality? Is it not lawful for a man to love a woman? I should have thought that the Bible, which you are always quoting, would have taught you otherwise. Also, once you were married yourself, else I should not be here, for which I am not sure that I thank you. At least I shouldn't were it not for Isobel." For a moment Mr. Knight could think of no answer to these arguments, but Sir John, having recovered his breath, attacked again. "Look here, young fellow, I have no time to listen to jaw about the Bible, and moral and immoral and all that bosh, which you can have out with your reverend parent afterwards. I am a plain man, I am, and want a plain answer to a plain question. Do you think that you are going to marry my daughter Isobel?" "Such is my desire and intention," replied Godfrey, with vague recollections of the baptismal service, though of these at the moment he was not aware. "Oh, is it? Then you are jolly well mistaken in your desire and intention. Let's make things clear. You are a beggarly youngster, who propose to enter the army at some future date, which you may or may not do, and you have the impudence to wish to marry one of the biggest heiresses in England against my will." "And against mine," burst in Mr. Knight, "who consider her a most pernicious young woman, one who rejects the Christian faith, and will leave you to perdition. That is why, when I chanced to espy you in such a compromising position, I hastened to inform the lady's father." "Oh, you did that, did you?" interposed Isobel, contemplating him steadily. "Well, I am glad to know who could have been so cowardly," she added with withering contempt. "Now I begin to wonder whether a letter, which some years ago I brought to the Abbey House to be forwarded to Godfrey, was ever posted to him who did not receive it, or whether, perhaps, it fell into the hands of some one like you." "It did," said Mr. Knight. "I read it and have it to this day. In my discretion as a father, I did not consider it desirable that my young son should receive that letter. What I have witnessed this afternoon shows me how right was my judgment." "Thank you so much," said Isobel. "That takes a great weight off my mind. Godfrey, my dear, I apologise to you for my doubts. The truth did occur to me, but I thought it impossible that a clergyman," here she looked again at Mr. Knight, "could be a thief also, who did not dare to own to his theft." "Never mind all that," went on Sir John, in his heavy masterful voice. "It stands like this. You," and he pointed a fat finger at Godfrey, "are, well, I'll tell you what you are. You're just a cunning young fortune hunter. You found out that this property and a good bit besides are coming to Isobel, and you want to collar the sag, like you did that of the old woman out in Lucerne. Well, you don't do it, my boy. I've other views for Isobel. Do you think I want to see her married to the son of a fellow like that? A canting snuffler who prigs letters and splits on his own son?" And swinging the fat finger round, he thrust it almost into the face of Mr. Knight. "What did you say?" gasped Godfrey. "That I am a fortune hunter?" "Yes, that's what I said, and I'll repeat it if you like." "Then," went on Godfrey, speaking in a thick, low voice, for now his temper had mastered him thoroughly. I say that you are a liar. I say that you are a base and vulgar man, who has made money somehow, and thinks that this justifies him in insulting those who are not base or vulgar, because they have less money. You infernal young scamp, shouted Sir John, in a roar like that of an angry bull. Do you dare to call me a liar? Apologise at once, or... And he stopped. I do not apologise. I repeat that you are a liar, the greatest liar I ever met. Now, or what? Thus spoke Godfrey, drawing his tall, slim young form to its full height, his dark eyes flashing, his fine face alight with righteous rage. Isobel, who was standing quite still and smiling a little, rather contemptuously, looked at him out of the corners of her eyes, and thought that anger became him well. Never before had he seemed so handsome to her approving judgment. All this, bellowed Sir John, and lifting the tightly rolled umbrella he carried, he struck Godfrey with all his strength upon the side of the head. Godfrey staggered, but fortunately the soft hat he was wearing, upon the brim of which the stroke fell, broke its weight to some extent, so that he was not really hurt. Only now he went quite mad in a kind of icy way, and springing at Sir John with the lightness of a leopard, dealt him 2 blows, one with his left hand and the next with his right. They were good straight blows, for boxing had been his favourite amusement at Sandhurst, where he was a middleweight champion. The first caught Sir John upon his thick lips, which were badly cut against the teeth, causing him to stagger, while the second, that with the right, landed on the bridge of his nose and blacked both his eyes. This, so strong and heavy was it, notwithstanding Sir John's great weight, knocked him clean off his feet. Back he went, and in his efforts to save himself, gripped Mr. Knight with one hand, and with the other the legs of the early Victorian angel that surmounted Lady Jane's grave, against which they were standing. Neither of these could withstand the strain. The angel, which was only pinned by lead-coated rivets to its base, and the column behind, flew from its supports, as did Mr. Knight from his, so that in another second, the men having tripped against the surround of the grave, all 3 rolled upon the path, the marble luckily falling clear of both of them. Now I've done it, said Godfrey in a reflective voice as he contemplated the tangled ruin. Yes, exclaimed Isobel, I think you have. Then they remained grim and silent while the pair, who were not really much injured, picked themselves up with groans. I am sorry that I knocked you down, since I am young and you are not, said Godfrey, but I repeat that you are a liar, he added by an afterthought. Sir John spat out a tooth, and began to mop the blood from his nose with a silk pocket-handkerchief. Oh, you do you? He said, in a somewhat subdued voice. Well, you'll find out that I'm other things too before I'm done with you, and I repeat that you are a fortune-hunting young rascal, and that I would rather see my daughter dead than married to you. And I say, Godfrey, I would rather see you dead than married to her, broke in Mr. Knight, spitting out his words like an angry cat. I don't think you need be afraid, father, answered Godfrey quietly, although his rage burned as fiercely as ever. You have worked this business well, and it seems a little impossible now, doesn't it? Listen, Sir John Blake, not even for the sake of Isobel will I submit to such insults. I will not give her up, but I swear by God that while you are alive I will not marry Isobel, nor will I write to her or speak to her again. After you are dead, which I dare say will be before so very long, and he surveyed the huge puffy-fleshed baronet with a critical eye, then if she cares to wait for me, I will marry her, hoping that in the meanwhile you may lose your money or dispose of it as you like. Sir John stared, still mopping his face, but finding no words. He feared death very much, and this prophecy of it, spoken with such a ring of truth, as though the speaker knew, frightened him. At that moment in his heart he cursed the Reverend Mr. Knight and his tale-bearing, and wished most earnestly that he had never been led into interference with this matter. After all, Godfrey was a fine young man whom his daughter cared for, and might do well in life, and he had struck him first after offering him intentional and prearranged insult. Such were the thoughts that flashed through his somewhat muddled brain. Also another, that they were too late. The evil was done and never could be undone. Then Isobel spoke in cold, clear tones, saying, "Godfrey is quite right, and has been right all through. Had you, father, and that man," and she pointed contemptuously at Mr. Knight, "left us alone, we should have come and told you what had happened between us, and if you disapproved, we would have waited until we were of full age, and have married as we should have been free to do. But now that is impossible, for blows have passed between you. After slandering him vilely, you struck Godfrey first, father, and he would not have been a man if he had not struck you back. Indeed, I should have thought little of him afterwards. Well, he has made an oath, and I know that he will keep it. Now I too make an oath, which certainly I shall keep. I swear in the presence of both of you, by myself and by Godfrey, that neither in this world or in any other, should I live again and have remembrance, will I marry any man, or exchange tenderness with any man, except himself. So all your plans came to nothing. Yes, you have brought all this misery upon us for nothing, and if you want to found a great family, as I know you do, you had better marry again yourself and let me go my way. In any case, if I should survive you, and should Godfrey live, I will marry him after your death, even if we have to wait until we are old to do so. As to your fortune, I care nothing for it, being quite ready to work in the world with the help of the little I have." She paused as though for an answer, but none came. For if Sir John had been frightened before, now he was terrified of this outraged young woman, who, tall, commanding, and stern-eyed, looked to him like an avenging angel. "There doesn't seem much more to say, does there?" she went on, "except that I think, father, you had better telegraph to your guests that you are not well and cannot receive them, for I won't. So good-bye, dearest Godfrey. I shall remember all that you have said, and you will remember all that I have said, and as I believe we shall live to meet again one day. Meanwhile, don't think too bitterly of my father, or of your own, because they have acted according to their natures and lights, though where these will lead them I am sure I do not know. Good-bye, dearest, dearest Godfrey. Do your best in the world, and keep out of troubles if you can. Oh, what a lot we shall have to tell each other when we meet again." Then before them both she kissed him, and he kissed her back, saying, "I will remember. I am glad you think there was nothing else to be done. God bless you, Isobel. Make the best of your life, as I will try to do with mine. Good-bye." "Good-bye, dear," she answered. "Think of me always when you wake and before you go to sleep, as I will think of you." Then she turned and went, never looking behind her. Godfrey watched her tall form vanish through the churchyard gate and over the slope of a little hill that lay between it and Hawks Hall, and that was the last sight he had of her for many a year. When she was quite lost to view, he spoke to the two men who still stood irresolute before him. "Isobel, I shall meet again," he said, "but not either of you, for I have done with you both. It is not for me to judge you. Judge yourself and be judged." Then he turned too and went. "It's all right," said Sir John to Mr. Knight. "That is, he won't marry her at any rate at present, so I suppose that we should both be pleased, if any one can be pleased with cut lip and two black eyes, and yet somehow we seem to have made a mess of it," and he glanced at the shattered marble statue of the Victorian angel, of which both the wings were broken off. "We have done our duty," replied Mr. Knight, pursing up his thin lips, "and at least Godfrey is freed from your daughter." "I'm not so sure of that, my reverend friend, but of one thing I am sure, that I am freed from her also, or rather that she is freed from me. Also you are freed from him. Don't you understand, you vicious little viper, that you will never see that young man again, and that thanks to your cursed advice I shall never see my daughter again. At least, not really. What devil was it that sent you to play upon my weaknesses and ambition? If you had left things alone and they had come to me in a natural way, there would have been a row, of course, but I dare say it would have ended all right. But you told me how to work on him, and I overdid the part. Now nothing can ever be all right for either of us, or for them either, until we are both dead. Do you understand also that we have made two young people, who should have been the supports of our old age, desire above everything our deaths, because we have given them cause to hate us? And since they are of the sort that keep their word, only by our deaths can they become free, or at any rate by mine. Well, it doesn't matter what you understand, you little bigot, but I know what I do. I have done my duty, repeated Mr. Knight sullenly, and I don't care what happens afterwards. Fiat justita ruat coelum, he added in the Latin tag. Oh yes, justice may say fie, and the sky may be rude, and anything else may happen, but we've dished our lives and theirs, my friend, and damn you, get out of my sight. Rows I am accustomed to with Isobel and others, but this isn't a row, it's an earthquake, it's a catastrophe, for which I have to thank you. Lord, how my mouth hurts, and I can't see out of my right eye. Talk of a mailed fist, that young beggar has one like a poleaxe. Now I must go to telegraph to all those people. Temporary indisposition, yes, temporary indisposition, that's it. Goodbye, my holy friend. You won't do so much mischief in one day again in a hurry. Spy as hard as you like. Then Sir John departed, nursing his cut lips with one hand and his broken umbrella with the other. Mr. Knight watched him go and said to himself, I thought that I disliked the daughter, but the father is worse. Offensive, purse-proud, vulgar beast. How dare he speak to me like that? I'm glad, yes, I'm glad Godfrey knocked him down, though I suppose there will be a scandal. Well, my hands are clean. I have done my duty, and I must not complain if it is unpleasant. Since I have dragged Godfrey back from the mouth of the pit, I think I'll take a walk to steady my nerves. It may be as well not to meet Godfrey again just now. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Love Eternal by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michele Eaton. India. On his road to the house to pack his portmanteau, Godfrey went a little way round to arrange with a blacksmith, generally known as Tom, who jobbed out a pony trap, to drive him to the station to catch the 7:15 train. The blacksmith remarked that they would have to hurry, and set to work to put the pony in, while Godfrey ran on to the Abbey House and hurriedly collected his clothes. He got them packed and down into the hall just as the trap arrived. As he was entering it, the servant put a letter into his hand, which she said had come for him by the afternoon post. He thrust it into his pocket unlooked at, and off they went at the pony's best pace. You are going away uncommon quick, Master Godfrey. Coming back to these parts soon? Queried the blacksmith. No, not for a long while, Tom. I think there must have been lightning with that rain, went on Tom after a pause, although I heard no thunder. Else however did that marble angel over poor Lady Jane's grave come down with such a smash? Godfrey glanced at him, but Tom remained imperturbable and went on. They do say it were a wonderful smash, what broke off both the wings, and nearly flattered out some as stood by. Rum thing, Master Godfrey, that the lightning should have picked out the grave of so good a lady to hit. Undiscriminating thing, lightning is. Stop talking humbug, Tom. Were you there? Asked Godfrey. Well, not exactly there, Master Godfrey, but I and one or two others was nigh, having heard voices louder than the common, just looking over the churchyard wall to tell truth. Oh, ejaculated Godfrey, and Tom continued in a reflective voice. My, they were two beauties, what you gave that old fat devil of a squire. If he'd been a bull instead of only roaring like one, they'd have brought him down, to say nothing of parson and the angel. I couldn't help it, Tom. I was mad. And no wonder, after being crumped on the nut with a tight umbrella. Why, I'd have done the same myself, baronet or no baronet. Oh, there's no need to explain. I knows everything about it, and so does every babe in the village by now, not to mention the old women. Master Godfrey, you take my advice. The next time you go a-courting, shut the door behind you, which I always made a point of doing when I was young. Being passing that way, I seed parson peeping in, and knowing you was there, guessed why. Truth is, I came to warn you after he'd gone up to the hall, but seeing how you was engaged, thought it a pity to interrupt, though now I wish I had. Godfrey groaned. There was nothing to say. Well, all the soot's in the cooking pot now, so to speak, proceeded Tom blandly, and we're downright sad about it, we are, for as my missus was saying, you'd make a pretty pair. But Lord, Master Godfrey, don't you take it too much to heart, for she's an upright young lady, she is, and steadfast, or if she ain't, there's plenty of others. Also one day follows another, as the saying goes, and the worst of old varmints don't live for ever. But parson, he beats me, and you, his son, so they tell, though I never could think it myself. If he ain't the meanest ferret I ever clapped eyes on, may the old mare fall down and break my neck. Well, he'll hear about it, I can promise him, especially if he meets my missus what's got a tongue in her head, and is a chapel woman into the bargain. Lord, there comes the train. Don't you fear, we'll catch her. Hold tight, Master Godfrey, and be ready to jump out. No, there ain't nothing to pay. I'll stick it on to parson's fare next time I've drove him. Goodbye, Master Godfrey, and God bless you, if only for that there right and left, which warmed my heart to see. And mind ye, he shouted after him, there's more young women in the world than ye meets in an afternoon's walk, and one nail drives another out, as being a smith by trade, I knows well. Godfrey bundled into an empty carriage with his portmanteau and his coat, and covered his face with his hands, that he might see no more of that accursed station, whence he seemed always to be departing in trouble. So everything had been overheard and seen, and doubtless the story would travel far and wide. Poor Isobel! As a matter of fact it did, but it was not Isobel who suffered, since public sympathy was strong on the side of her and of her lover. The indignation of the neighbourhood concentrated itself upon the squire and the parson, especially the latter. Indeed, the village showed its sympathy with the victims and its wrath with the oppressors by going on strike. Few beaters turned up to Sir John's next shooting party, and on the following Sunday Mr. Knight preached to empty benches, a vacuum that continued from week to week. The end of it was he became so unpopular, and his strained relations with Sir John grew so notorious, that the bishop, who like everyone else knew the whole story, gently suggested to him that a change of livings would be to his advantage, also to that of the church in Monksacre and its neighbourhood. So Mr. Knight departed to another parish in a remote part of the diocese, which, having been inundated by the sea, was almost devoid of inhabitants, and saw the Abbey and Hawks Hall no more. In searching his pocket for matches, Godfrey found the letter which had been given to him as he left the Abbey. He knew the writing on the envelope at once, and was minded not to open it, for this and the foreign stamp told him that it came from Madame Raines. Still, curiosity, or a desire to take his mind off the miseries by which it was beset, prevailed, and he did open the envelope and read. It ran thus: Ah, my little friend, my godson in the spirit, Godfrey. I dare say you thought that poor old Madame was dead, gone to join the celestials, because you have not heard from her for so long a while. Not a bit, my little Godfrey, though perhaps I should not call you little, since my crystal shows me that you have grown taller even than you were in the old days at Lucerne, and much broader, quite a good-made man and nice to look at. Well, my Godfrey, I hear things about you sometimes, for the most part from the spirit called Eleanor, who I warn you has a great bone to pick with you, because you see people do not change so much as you think when they get to the other side. So a woman remains a woman, and being a woman she stays jealous, and does not like it when her affinity turns the back on her, as you have done on Eleanor. Therefore she will give you a bad trick if she can, just as a woman would upon the earth. Also I hear of you sometimes from Miss Ogilvy, or rather her spirit, for she is as fond of you as ever. So fond that I think you must have mixed up together in a previous life, because otherwise there is nothing to account for it. She tries to protect you from Eleanor the indignant, with whom she has, I gather, much row. Now for my message, which come to me from all these spirits. I hear you have done very well in what they call examinations, and have before you a shining future. But do not think that you will be happy, my Godfrey, for you will not get that girl you want for a long, long while, and then only for the shortest of time, just enough to kiss and say, "Oh, my pretty, how nice you are," and then au revoir to the world of spirits. Meanwhile, being a little fool, you will go empty and hungry, since you are not one of those who hate the woman, which after all is the best thing in life for the man while he is young, like, so the spirits tell me, does your dear papa. And oh, how plenty this woman fruit hang on every tree, so why not pluck and eat before the time come, when you cannot, because if you still have appetite, those nice plums turn your stomach. So you have a bad time before you, my Godfrey, waiting for the big fat plum far away, which you cannot see or touch, and much less taste, while the other nice plums fall into different hands, or wither, waiting to be eaten. At end, when you get your big fat plum, just as you set your teeth into it, oh, something blow it out of your mouth. I know not what the spirits will not say, perhaps because they do not know, for they have not prescience of all things. But of this be sure, my Godfrey, when that happens, that is your own fault, for had you trusted to your godmamma Rains, it never would have chanced, since she would have shown you how to get your plum and eat it to the stone, and then throw away the stone and get other plums and be happy and full instead of empty. Well, so it is, and as I must tell you, there is but one hope for you, unless you would go sorrowful, to come back to your godmamma, who will teach you how to walk and be happy and get all you want. Also, since she is now poor, you would do well to send her a little money to this address in Italy, since that old humbug of a pasteur, whom she cannot harm because of the influences round him, still prevents her from returning to Switzerland, where she has friends. Now that big plum, it is very nice, and you desire it much. Come to your godmamma, and she will show you how to get it off the tree quickly. Yes, within 1 year. Or do not come, and it will hang there for many winters, and shrivel as plums do. And at last one bite, and it will be gone. And then, my godson, then, my dear Godfrey, well, perhaps I will tell you the rest another time. You poor silly boy, who will not understand that the more you get, the more you will always have. Your godmamma, who love you still, although you treat her so badly, the Countess of Rains. Ah, you did not know I had that title, did you? But in the spirit world I have others which are much higher. Godfrey thrust this precious epistle back into his pocket with a feeling of physical and mental sickness. How did this horrible woman know so much about him and his affairs, and why did she prophesy such dreadful things? Further, if her knowledge was so accurate, although veiled in her foreign metaphor, why should not her prophecies be accurate also? And if they were, why should he be called upon to suffer so many things? He could find no answer to these questions, but afterwards he sent her letter to the pasteur, who in due course returned it with some upright and manly comments, both upon the epistle itself and the story of his troubles, which Godfrey had detailed to him, Amongst much else he wrote in French. You suffer and cannot understand why, my dear boy. Nor do I, but it is truth that all who are worth anything are called upon to suffer. To what end we do not know. Nothing of value is gained except by suffering. Why again we do not know. This wretched woman is right in a way when she refers all solutions to another world. Only her other world is one that is bad, and her solutions are very base. Be sure that there are other and better ones that we shall learn in due time, when this little sun has set for us. For it will rise elsewhere, Godfrey, in a brighter sky. Meanwhile, do not be frightened by her threats, for even if they should all be true, to those evils which she prophesies there is, be sure, another interpretation. As I think one of your poets has said, we add our figures until they come even. So go your way and keep as upright as you can, and have no fear, since God is over all, not the devil. Thus preached the pasteur, and what he said gave Godfrey the greatest comfort. Still, being young, he made one mistake. He did send Madame Raines some money, partly out of pity, £10 in a postal order without any covering letter, a folly that did not tend to a cessation of her epistolatory efforts. On reaching town, Godfrey went straight to Hampstead. There, to his surprise, he found all prepared for his reception. I was expecting you, my dear, said Mrs. Parsons, and even have a little bit extra in the house in case you should come. Why, when I told you I had gone home for a month? Asked Godfrey. For the same reason as I knows that oil and vinegar won't abide mixed in the same bottle. I was sure enough that being a man grown, you and your father could never get on together in one house. But perhaps there is something else in it too, she added doubtfully. Thus Godfrey told her that there was something else, and indeed all about the business. Well, there you are, and there's nothing to be said, or at least so much that it comes to the same thing, remarked Mrs. Parsons in a reflective tone when he had finished his story. But what I want to know, she went on, is why these kind of things happen. You two, I mean you and Miss Isobel, are just fitted to each other, appointed together by nature, so to speak, and fond as a couple of doves upon a perch. So why shouldn't you take each other and have done? What is there to come between a young man and young woman such as you are? I don't know, groaned Godfrey. No, nor don't I, and yet something does come between. What's the meaning of it all? Why do things always go cussed in this here world? Is there a devil about what manages it, or is it just chance? Why shouldn't people have what they want, and when it's wanted, instead of being forced to wait until perhaps it isn't, or can't be enjoyed, or often enough to lose it altogether? You can't answer, and nor can't I, only at times I do think, notwithstanding all my Christian teachings and hundreds of your father's sermons, that the devil, he's top dog here. And as for that there foreign woman whose letter you've read to me, she's his housemaid. Not but what I'm sure it will all come right at last, she added, with an attempt at cheerfulness. I hope so, replied Godfrey without conviction, and went to bed. Presently he descended from his room again, bearing a pill-box in which was enclosed a certain ring that years before he had bought at Lucerne. A ring set with 2 hearts of turquoise. I promised not to write, he said, but you might address this to her. She'll know what it is, for I told her about it. Yes, said Mrs. Parsons, the young lady shall have that box of pills. Being upset, it may do her good. In due course, Isobel did have it. Also the box came back addressed to Mrs. Parsons. In it was another ring, a simple band of ancient gold. As a matter of fact, it was Roman, a betrothal ring of 2,000 years ago. Round it was a scrap of paper on which was written, "This was dug up in a grave. My great-grandmother gave it to my great-grandfather when they became engaged about 100 years ago, and he wore it all his life, as in a bygone age someone else had done. Now the great-granddaughter gives it to another, let him wear it all his life, whatever happens to her or to him, then let it go to the grave again, perhaps to be worn by others far centuries hence. Godfrey understood, and set it on the third finger of his left hand, where it remained night and day, and year by year. So that matter ended, and afterwards came silence and darkness, which endured for 10 years or more. From his father he heard nothing, nor on his part did he ever write to him again. Indeed, the first news concerning him which reached Godfrey was that of his death, which happened some 7 years later, apparently after a brief illness. Even of this he would not have learned, since no one took the trouble to put it in any paper that he saw, had it not chanced that the Reverend Mr. Knight died intestate, and that therefore his small belongings descended to Godfrey as his natural heir. With them were a number of papers, among which, in the after days, Godfrey found the very letter that Isobel wrote to him, which his father posted in his desk. For his son there was no word, a circumstance that showed the implacability of this man's character. Notwithstanding his continual profession of the highest Christian principles, he could never forget or forgive, and this although it was he who was in fault. For what wrong had Godfrey done to him in loving a woman whom he did not chance to like? So he died silent, bearing his resentment to the grave, and yet some odd sense of justice prevented him from robbing Godfrey of his little inheritance, something under £2,000, that came on a policy of insurance and certain savings, a sum which in after years, when money was plentiful with him, Godfrey appointed to the repair and beautifying of the Abbey Church at Monk's Acre. Strangely enough, although from his childhood they had been always estranged, Godfrey felt this conduct of his father very much indeed. It seemed dreadful to him that he should vanish thus into the darkness, taking his wrath with him, and often he wondered if it still animated him there. Also he wondered what could be the possible purpose of it all, and indeed why his father was so fashioned that he could grow venomous over such a matter. To all of which questions no answer came, although one suggested itself to him, namely, that he was the victim of some hereditary taint, and therefore not in fact to blame. In the case of Isobel, the darkness was equally dense, for both of them kept their word, and with the single exception of the episode of the exchange of rings, neither attempted to communicate with the other directly or indirectly. From Mrs. Parsons he heard that Hawks Hall was shut up, and that Sir John and his daughter lived mostly in London, or at a place that the former had bought in Scotland. Once indeed Mrs. Parsons did write, or got someone else to write to him, that she had seen Isobel drive past her in the street, and that she looked well, though rather stern and quiet-like. That was all the news Godfrey had of Isobel during those 10 years, since she was not a person who advertised her movements in the papers, although for her sake he became a great student of society gossip. Also he read with care all announcements of engagements and marriages in the Times, and the deaths too, for the matter of that, but happily quite without result. Indeed, in view of her declaration, he ought to have been, and in fact was, ashamed of his research, but then, who could be quite sure of anything in this world? Sir John, he knew, was living, because from time to time he saw his name in lists of subscriptions of a sort that appear under royal patronage and are largely advertised. So between these two swung a veil of darkness, although, had he but known it, this was not nearly so impenetrable to Isobel as to himself. Somehow, possibly, Arthur Thorburn had friends with whom he corresponded in England, who knew Isobel. She acquired information as to every detail of his career. Indeed, when he came to learn everything, he was absolutely amazed at the particulars with which she was acquainted, whereof there were certain that he would have preferred to have kept to himself. But she had them all, with dates and surrounding circumstances and the rest. Thousands of miles of ocean had been no bar to her searching gaze. For his part, he was not without consolations, since, strangely enough, he never felt as if she were lost to him, or indeed far away. It was always as though she were in the next room, or at any rate in the next street. There are individuals of sensitive mind, and he was one of them, who know well enough when such a total loss has occurred. It has been well said that the dead are never really dead to us until they are forgotten, and the same applies to the living. While they remember us, they are never so very far away, and what is more, we, or some of us, are quite aware if they have ceased to remember, for then the door is shut, and the doorway built up, and our hearts tell us that this has been done. In Godfrey's case with Isobel, not only did the doorway remain unfilled, the door itself was always ajar. Although seas divided them, and over these no whisper came, yet he felt her thought leaping to him across the world. Especially did this happen at night, when he laid himself down to sleep, perhaps because then his mind was most receptive, and since their hours of going to rest must have been different, he being in India and she in England, she could scarcely have been reflecting on him, as he fondly believed, at the moment when she too entered into the world called sleep. Therefore, either it was all imagination, or he caught her waking thoughts, or perhaps those that haunted her upon this borderland were delayed until his subtler being could interpret them. Who knows? At least, unless something had happened to disturb him, those nights were rare when he was shutting his eyes. Godfrey did not seem to be sensible of Isobel's presence. At any rate, he knew that she had not forgotten. He knew that somewhere in the vast world she was ever thinking of him with more intensity than she thought of any other man or thing. And during all those lonely years, this knowledge or belief was his greatest comfort. Not that Godfrey's life in India was in any way unhappy. On the contrary, it was a full and active life. He worked hard at his profession and succeeded in it to a limited extent. And he had his friends, especially his great friend Arthur Thorburn, who always clung to him. He had his flirtations also, being a man of susceptibility who was popular with women. How could they be avoided? For above all things Godfrey was a man, not a hermit or a saint or an aesthete, but just a man with more gifts of a sort than have some others. He lived the life of the rest. He hunted, he shot tigers, doing those things that the Anglo-Indian officer does, but all the same he studied. Whether it were of his trade of soldiering, or of the natives, or of Eastern thought and law, he was always learning something, till at last he knew a great deal. Often he wondered to what end. And yet with all his friends and acquaintances, in a way he remained a very lonely man, as those who are a little out of the ordinary often do. In the common groove we rub against the other marbles running down it, but once we leap over its edge, then where are we? We cannot wander off into space because of the attraction of the earth that is so near to us, and yet we are alone in the air until with a bump we meet our native ground. Therefore, for the most of us, the groove is much better, and yet some who leave it have been carried elsewhere, if only for a little while, like St. Paul into the third heaven. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Love Eternal by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michele Eaton. France and after. Nothing so very remarkable happened to Godfrey during those 10 years of his life in India, or at least only one or two things. Thus once he got into a scrape for which he was not really responsible, and got out of it again, as he imagined without remark, until Isobel showed her common and rather painful intimacy with its details, of which she appeared to take a somewhat uncharitable view, at any rate so far as the lady was concerned. The other matter was more serious, since it involved the loss of his greatest friend, Arthur Thorburn. Briefly, what happened was this. There was a frontier disturbance. Godfrey, who by now was a staff officer, had been sent to a far outpost held by Thorburn with a certain number of men, and there took command. A reconnaissance was necessary, and Thorburn went out for that purpose with over half of the available garrison of the post, having received written orders that he was not to engage the enemy unless he found himself absolutely surrounded. In the end, Thorburn did engage the enemy, with the result that practically he and his force were exterminated, but not before they had inflicted such a lesson on the said enemy that it sued for peace and has been great friends with the British power ever since. First, however, a feeble attack was made on Godfrey's camp that he beat off without the loss of a single man, exaggerated accounts of which were telegraphed home representing it as a Rorke's Drift defence. Godfrey was heartbroken. He had loved this man as a brother, more indeed than brothers often love, and now Thorburn, his only friend, was dead. The darkness had taken him, that impenetrable, devouring darkness out of which we come and into which we go. Religion told him he should not grieve, that Thorburn doubtless was much better off whither he had gone than he could ever have been on earth. Although it was true, the same religion said that he might be much worse off, since thither his failings would have followed him. Dismissing the latter possibility, how could he be happy in a new world, Godfrey wondered, having left all he cared for behind him, and without possibility of communication with them? In short, all the old problems of which he had not thought much since Miss Ogilvy died came back to Godfrey with added force and left him wretched. Nor was he consoled by the sequel of the affair, of which he was bound to report the facts. The gallant man who was dead was blamed unjustly for what had happened, as perhaps he deserved who had not succeeded, since those who set their blind eye to the telescope, as Nelson did, must justify their action by success. Godfrey, on the other hand, who had done little but defeat an attack made by exhausted and dispirited men, was praised to the skies and found himself figuring as a kind of hero in the English press, which after a long period of peace, having lost all sense of proportion in such matters, was glad of anything that could be made to serve the purposes of sensation. Ultimately he was thanked by the government of India, made a brevet major, and decorated with the D.S.O., of all of which it may be said with truth that never were such honours received with less pleasure. So much did he grieve over this unhappy business that his health was affected, and being run down, in the end he took some sort of fever, and was very ill indeed. When at length he recovered, more or less, he went before a medical board, who ordered him promptly to England on 6 months' leave. Most men would have rejoiced, but Godfrey did not. He had little wish to return to England, where, except Mrs. Parsons, there were none he desired to see, save one whom he was sworn not to see. This he could bear while they were thousands of miles apart, but to be in the same country with Isobel, in the same town perhaps, and forbidden to hear her voice or to touch her hand, how could he bear that? Still he had no choice in this matter, arranged by the hand of fate, and went, reflecting that he would go to Lucerne and spend the time with the pasteur. Perhaps even he would live in the beautiful house that Miss Ogilvy had left to him, or a corner of it, seeing that it was empty, for the tenants to whom it had been let had gone away. So he started at the end of the first week in July 1914. When his ship reached Marseille, it was to find that the world was buzzing with strange rumours. There was talk of war in Europe. Russia was said to be mobilising. Germany was said to be mobilising. France was said to be mobilising. It was even rumoured that England might be drawn into some titanic struggle of the nations, and yet no accurate information was obtainable. The English papers they saw were somewhat old, and their reports vague in the extreme. Much excited like everyone else, Godfrey telegraphed to the India Office, asking leave to come home direct overland, which he could not do without permission, since he was in command of a number of soldiers who were returning to England on furlough. No answer came to his wire before his ship sailed, and therefore he was obliged to proceed by long sea. Still it had important consequences, which at the moment he could not foresee. In the bay, the tidings that reached them by Marconigram were evidently so carefully censored that out of them they could make nothing, except that the empire was filled with great doubt and anxiety, and that the world stood on the verge of such a war as had never been known in history. At length they came to Southampton, where the pilot boat brought him a telegram, ordering him to report himself without delay. 3 hours later he was in London. At the India Office, where he was kept waiting a while, he was shown into the room of a prominent and harassed official who had some papers in front of him. "You are Major Knight," said the official. "Well, here is your record before me, and it is good, very good indeed. But I see that you are on sick leave. Are you too ill for service?" "No," answered Godfrey. "The voyage has set me up. I feel as well as ever I did." "That's fortunate," answered the official. "But there is a doctor on the premises, and to make sure he shall have to look at you. Go down and see him, if you will, and then come back here with his report." And he rang a bell and gave some orders. Within half an hour, Godfrey was back in the room with a clean bill of health. The official read the certificate and remarked that he was going to send him over to the War Office, where he would make an appointment for him by telephone. "What for, sir?" asked Godfrey. "You see, I am only just off my ship and very ignorant of the news." "The news is, Major Knight, that we shall be at war with Germany before we are 12 hours older," was the solemn answer. "Officers are wanted, and we are giving every good man from India on whom we can lay our hands. They won't put you on the staff, because you have everything to learn about European work, but I expect they will find you a billet in one of the expeditionary regiments. And now goodbye and good luck to you, for I have lots of men to see. By the way, I take it for granted that you volunteered for the job." "Of course," replied Godfrey simply, and went away to wander about the endless passages of the War Office, till at length he discovered the man whom he must see. A few tumultuous days went by, and he found himself upon a steamer crossing to France, attached to a famous English regiment. The next month always remained in Godfrey's mind as a kind of nightmare, in which he moved on plains stained the colour of blood, beneath a sky black with bellowing thunder, and illumined occasionally by a blaze of splendour. It would be useless to attempt to set out the experience and adventures of the particular cavalry regiment to which he was attached as a major, since, notwithstanding their infinite variety, they were such as all shared whose glory it was to take part with what the Kaiser called the contemptible little army of England in the ineffable retreat from Mons, that retreat which saved France and civilization. Godfrey played his part well, once or twice with heroism indeed, but what of that amid 80,000 heroes? Back he staggered with the rest, exhausted, sleepless, fighting, his mind filled alternately with horror and with wonder, horror at the deeds to which men can sink and the general scheme of things that makes them possible, wonder at the heights to which they can rise when lifted by the inspiration of a great ideal and a holy cause. Death, he reflected, could not after all mean so very much to man, seeing how bravely it was met every minute of the day and night, and that the aspect of it, often so terrible, did but encourage others in like fashion to smile and die. But oh, what did it all mean? And who ruled this universe with such a flaming, blood-stained sword? Then at last came the turn of the tide, when the hungry German wolf was obliged to abandon that Paris which already he thought between his jaws, and a few days after it, the charge, the one splendid, perfect charge that consoled Godfrey, and those with him for all which they had suffered, lost and feared. He was in command of the regiment now, for those superior to him had been killed, and he directed and accompanied that charge. They thundered on to the mass of the Germans, who were retreating with no time to entrench or set entanglements. A gentle slope in front, and hard clear ground beneath their horses' feet. They cut through them, they trod them down, they drove them by scores and hundreds into the stream beyond, till those 2 battalions, or what remained of them, were but a tangled, drowning mob. It was finished. The English squadron turned to retreat as had been ordered. Then of a sudden Godfrey felt a dull blow. For a few moments consciousness remained to him. He called out some command about the retirement. It came to his mind that thus it was well to die in the moment of his little victory. After that, blackness. When his sense returned to him, he found himself lying in the curtained corner of a big room. At least he thought it was big because of the vast expanse of ceiling, which he could see above the curtain rods, and the sounds without, some of which seemed to come from a distance. There was a window, too, through which he caught sight of lawns and statues and formal trees. Just then the curtain was drawn, and there appeared a middle-aged woman dressed in white, looking very calm, very kind, and very spotless, who started a little when she saw that his eyes were open and that his face was intelligent. "Where am I?" he asked, and was puzzled to observe that the sound of his voice seemed feeble and far away. "In the hospital at Versailles," she answered in a pleasant voice. "Indeed," he murmured. "It occurred to me that it might be heaven or some place of the sort." "If you looked through the curtain you wouldn't call it heaven," she said with a sigh, adding, "No, Major, you were near to going west, very near, but you never got to the gates of heaven." "I can't remember," he murmured again. "Of course you can't, so don't try, for you see you got it in the head, a bit of shell, and a nice operation, or rather operations, they had over you. If it wasn't for that clever surgeon... But there, never mind. Shall I recover?" "Of course you will. We have had no doubt about that for the last week. You have been here nearly 3, you know. Only, you see, we thought you might be blind, something to do with the nerves of the eyes. But it appears that isn't so. Now, be quiet, for I can't stop talking to you with 2 dying just outside, and another whom I hope to save. One thing, nurse, about the war. Have the Germans got Paris?" "That's a silly question, Major, which makes me think you ain't so right as I believed. If those brutes had Paris, do you think you would be at Versailles? Or at any rate that I should? Don't you bother about the war. It's all right, or as right as it is likely to be for many a long day." Then she went. A week later Godfrey was allowed to get out of bed, and was even carried to sit in the autumn sunshine among other shattered men. Now he learned all there was to know, that the German rush had been stayed, that they had been headed off from Calais, and that the armies were entrenching opposite to each other and preparing for the winter. The Allied cause having been saved, as it were, by a miracle, at any rate for the while. He was still very weak, with great pain in his head, and could not read at all, which grieved him. So the time went by till at last he was told he was to be sent to England, as his bed was wanted, and he could recover there as well as in France. 2 days later he started in a hospital train, and suffered much upon the journey, although it was broken for a night at Boulogne. Still he came safely to London, and was taken to a central hospital, where next day several doctors held a consultation over him. When it was over, they asked him if he had friends in London and wished to stay there. He replied that he had no friends except an old nurse at Hampstead, if she was still there, and that he did not like London. Then there was talk among them, and the word Torquay was mentioned. The head doctor seemed to agree, but as he was leaving, changed his mind. Too long a journey, he said. It would knock him up. Give me that list. Here, this place will do. Quite close, and got up regardless. I am told, for she's very rich. That's what he wants, comfort and first-class food, and with a nod to Godfrey, who was listening in an idle fashion, quite indifferent as to his destination, he was gone. Next day they carried him off in an ambulance through the crowded Strand, and presently he found himself at Liverpool Street, where he was put into an invalid carriage. He asked the orderly where he was going, but the man did not seem to know, or had forgotten the name. So, troubling no more about it, he took a dose of medicine as he had been ordered, and presently went to sleep, as no doubt it was intended that he should do. When he woke up again, it was to find himself being lifted from another ambulance into a house which was very dark, perhaps because of the lighting orders, for now night had fallen. He was carried in a chair up some stairs into a very nice bedroom, and there put to bed by two men. They went away, leaving him alone. Something puzzled him about the place. At first he could not think what it was. Then he knew. The smell of it was familiar to him. He did not recognise the room, but the smell he did seem to recognise. Though being weak and shaken, he could not connect it with any particular house or locality. Now there were the voices in the passage, and he knew that he must be dreaming, for the only one that he could really hear sounded exactly like to that of old Mrs. Parsons. He smiled at the thought and shut his eyes. The voice that was like to that of Mrs. Parsons died away, saying as it went, "No, I haven't got the names, but I dare say they are downstairs. I'll go and look." The door opened and he heard someone enter, a woman this time by her tread. He did not see, both because his eyes were still almost closed, and for the reason that the electric light was heavily shaded. So he just lay there, wondering quite vaguely where he was and who the woman might be. She came near to the bed and looked down at him, for he heard her dress rustle as she bent. Then he became aware of a very strange sensation. He felt as though something were flowing from that woman to him, some strange and concentrated power of thought which was changing into a kind of agony of joy. The woman above him began to breathe quickly, in sighs as it were, and he knew that she was stirred. He knew that she was wondering. "I cannot see his face. I cannot see his face," she whispered in a strained, unnatural tone. Then with some swift movement she lifted the shade that was over the lamp. He too turned his head and opened his eyes. Oh God! There over him leant Isobel, clad in a nurse's robes. Yes, Isobel, unless he were mad. Next moment he knew that he was not mad, for she said one word, only one, but it was enough. "Godfrey!" "Isobel," he gasped, "is it you?" She made no answer, at least in words, only she bent down and kissed him on the lips. "You mustn't do that," he whispered. "Remember our promise." "I remember," she answered. "Am I likely to forget? It was that you would never see me nor come into this house while my father lived. Well, he died a month ago." Then a doubt struck her and she added swiftly, "Didn't you want to come here?" "Want, Isobel? What else have I wanted for 10 years? But I didn't know. My coming here was just an accident." "Are there such things as accidents?" she queried. "Was it an accident when 20 years ago I found you sleeping in the schoolroom at the Abbey and kissed you on the forehead? Or when I found you sleeping a few minutes ago, 20 whole years later?" And she paused. "And kissed me, not upon the forehead," said Godfrey reflective, adding, I never knew about that first kiss. Thank you for it. Not upon the forehead, she repeated after him, colouring a little. You see, I have faith and take a great deal for granted. If I should be mistaken— Oh, don't trouble about that, he broke in, because you know it couldn't be. 10 years or 10,000, and it would make no difference. I wonder, she mused. Oh, how I wonder. Do you think it possible that we shall be living 10,000 years hence? Quite, he answered with cheerful assurance. Much more possible than that I should be living today. What's 10,000 years? It's quite 100,000 since I saw you. Don't laugh at me, she exclaimed. Why not, dear, when there's nothing in the whole world at which I wouldn't laugh at just now, although I would rather look at you. Also, I wasn't laughing, I was loving, and when one is loving very much, the truth comes out. Then you really think it true about the 10,000 years, I mean? Of course, dear, he answered, and this time his voice was serious enough. Did we not tell each other yonder in the Abbey that ours was the love eternal? Yes, but words cannot make eternity. No, but thoughts and the will behind them can, for we reap what we sow. Why do you say that? She asked quickly. I can't tell you, except because I know that it is so. We come to strange conclusions out yonder, where only death seems to be true, and all the rest a dream. What we call the real and the unreal get mixed. A kind of wave of happiness passed through her, so obvious that it was visible to the watching Godfrey. If you believe it, I dare say that it is so, for you always had what they call vision, had you not? Then, without waiting for an answer, she went on. What nonsense we are talking. Don't you understand, Godfrey, that I am quite old? Yes, he answered, getting on. 6 months younger than I am, I think. Oh, it's different with a man. Another dozen years and I'm finished. Possibly, except for that eternity before you. Also, she continued, I am even more beautiful than you were 10 years ago, at any rate to me, he broke in. You foolish Godfrey, she murmured, and moved a little away from him. Just then the door opened, and Mrs. Parsons, looking very odd in a nurse's dress, with the cap awry upon her grey hair, entered carrying a bit of paper. The hunt I had, she began. That silly new-fangled kind of a girl clerk, having stuck the paper away under the letter O for officers, you know, miss, in some fancy box of hers, and then gone off to tea. Here are the names, but I can't see without my specs. At this point something in the attitude of the two struck her, something that her instincts told her was uncommon, and she stood irresolute. Isobel stepped to her as though to take the list, and bending down, whispered into her ear. What? Said Mrs. Parsons. Surely I didn't understand. You know I'm getting deaf as well as blind. Say the name again. Isobel obeyed, still in a whisper. Him! Exclaimed the old woman. Him! Our Godfrey! And you've been and let on who you were? You who call yourself a nursing commandant? Why, I dare say you'll be the death of him. Out you go, miss, anyway. I'll take charge of this case for the present. And as it seemed to Godfrey, watching from the far corner, literally she bundled Isobel from the room. Then she shut and locked the door. Coming to the bedside, she knelt down rather stiffly, looked at him for a while to make sure, and kissed him not once but many times. So you have come back, my dear, she said, and only half dead. Well, we won't have no young woman pushing between you and me just at present, commandant or not. Time enough for love-making when you are stronger. Oh, and I never thought to see you again. There must be a good God somewhere after all, although he did make them Germans. Then again she fell to kissing and blessing him, her hot tears dropping on his face, and upsetting him 10 times as much as Isobel had done. Since in this topsy-turvy world often things work by contraries, oddly enough no harm came to Godfrey from these fierce excitements. Instead, he slept better than he had done since he found his mind again, and awoke, still weak of course, but without any temperature or pains in his head. Now it was that there began the most blissful period of all his life. Isobel, when she had recovered her balance, made him understand that he was a patient, and that exciting talk or acts must be avoided. He, on his part, fell in with her wishes, and indeed was well content to do so. For a while he wanted nothing more than just to lie there and watch her moving in and out of his room, with his food or flowers or whatever it might be, for a burst of bad weather prevented him from going out of doors. Then as he strengthened she began to talk to him, which Mrs. Parsons did long before that event, telling him all that for years he had longed to know. No, not all, but some things. Among other matters she described to him the details of her father's end, which occurred in a very characteristic fashion. "You see, dear," she said, "as he grew older, his passion for money-making increased more and more. Why, I am sure I cannot say, seeing that heaven knows he had enough." "Yes," said Godfrey, "I suppose you are a very rich woman." She nodded, saying, "So rich that I don't know how rich, for really I haven't troubled even to read all the figures, and as yet they are not complete. Moreover, I believe that soon I shall be much richer. I'll tell you why presently. The odd thing is, too, that my father died intestate, so I get every farthing. I believe he meant to make a will with some rather peculiar provisions that perhaps you can guess, but this will was never made." "Why not?" asked Godfrey. "Because he died first, that's all. It was this way. He, or rather his firm, which is only another name for him, for he owned 3/4 of the capital, got some tremendous shipping contract with the government arising out of the war, that secures an enormous profit to them. How much I can't tell you, but hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds. He had been very anxious about this contract, for his terms were so stiff that the officials who managed such affairs hesitated about signing them. At last one day, after a long, and I gather, stormy interview with I don't know whom, in the course of which some rather strong language seems to have been used, the contract was signed and delivered to the firm. My father came home to this house with a copy of it in his pocket. He was very triumphant, for he looked at the matter solely from a business point of view, not at all from that of the country. Also he was very tired, for he had aged much during the last few years, and suffered occasionally from heart attacks. To keep himself up, he drank a great deal of wine at dinner, first champagne, and then the best part of a bottle of port. This made him talkative, and he kept me sitting there to listen to him while he boasted, poor man, of how he had walked round the officials who thought themselves so clever, but never saw some trap which he had set for them. "And what did you do?" asked Godfrey. "You know very well what I did. I grew angry, I could not help it, and told him I thought it was shameful to make money wrongfully out of the country at such a time, especially when he did not want it at all. Then he was furious and answered that he did want it, to support the peerage which he was going to get. He said also," she added slowly, "that I was an ignorant, interfering vixen. Yes, that is what he called me, a vixen, who had always been a disappointment to him and thwarted his plans. However," he went on, "as you think so little of my hard-earned money, I'll take care that you don't have more of it than I can help. I am not going to leave it to be wasted on silly charities by a sour old maid, for that's what you are, since you can't get hold of your precious parson's son, who I hope will be sent to the war and killed. I'll see the lawyers to-morrow and make a will, which I hope you'll find pleasant reading one day." I answered that he might make what will he liked, and left the room, though he tried to stop me. About half an hour later I saw the butler running about the garden where I was, looking for me in the gloom, and hearing him calling, "Come to Sir John, miss, come to Sir John." I went in, and there was my father fallen forward on the dining-room table, with blood coming from his lips, though I believe this was caused by a crushed wine-glass. His pocket-book was open beneath him, in which he had been writing figures of his estate, and, I think, headings for the will he meant to make, but these I could not read since the faint pencilling was blotted out with blood. He was quite dead from some kind of stroke, followed by heart failure, as the doctors said. "Is that all the pleasant story?" asked Godfrey. "Yes, except that there being no will, I inherited everything, or shall do so. I tried to get that contract cancelled, but could not. First, because having once made it, the government would not consent, since to do so would have been a reflection on those concerned, and secondly, for the reason that the other partners in the shipping business objected, so we shall have to give it back in some other way." Godfrey looked at her and said, "You meant to say that you will have to give it back." "I don't know what I meant," she answered, colouring. "But having said we, I think I will be like the government and stick to it. That is, unless you object very much, my dear." "Object? I object?" And taking the hand that was nearest to him, he covered it with kisses. As he did so, he noted that for the first time she wore the little ring with turquoise hearts upon her third finger, the ring that so many years before he had bought at Lucerne, the ring that through Mrs. Parsons he had sent her in the pill-box on the evening of their separation. This was the only form of engagement that ever passed between them, the truth being that from the moment he entered the place it was all taken for granted, not only by themselves, but by everyone in the house, including the wounded. With this development of an intelligent instinct, it is possible that Mrs. Parsons had something to do. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Love Eternal by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michele Eaton. Marriage. In that atmosphere of perfect bliss, Godfrey's cure was quick. For bliss it was, save only that there was another bliss beyond to be attained. Remember that this man, now approaching middle life, had never drunk of the cup of what is known as love upon the earth. Some might answer that such is the universal experience, that true complete love has no existence, except it be that love of God, to which a few at last attain, since in what we know as God's completeness and absolute unity can be found alone. Other loves all have their flaws, with one exception perhaps, that of the love of the dead, which fondly we imagine to be unchangeable. For the rest, passion, however exalted, passes or at least becomes dull with years. The most cherished children grow up, and in so doing, by the law of nature, grow away. Friends are estranged and lost in their own lives. Upon the earth there is no perfect love. It must be sought elsewhere, since having the changeful shadows, we know there is a sky wherein shines the sun that casts them. Godfrey, as it chanced, omitting Isobel, had walked little even in these sweet shadows. There were but 3 others for whom he had felt devotion in all his days: Mrs. Parsons, his tutor Monsieur Boisette, and his friend Arthur Thorburn, who was gone. Therefore to him Isobel was everything. As a child he had adored her. As a woman she was his desire, his faith, and his worship. If this was so with him, still more was it the case with Isobel, who in truth cared for no other human being. Something in her nature prevented her from contracting violent female friendships, and to all men, except a few of ability, each of them old enough to be her father, she was totally indifferent. Indeed, most of them repelled her. On Godfrey and Godfrey alone, from the first moment she saw him as a child, she had poured all the deep treasure of her heart. He was at once her divinity and her other self, the segment that completed her life's circle, without which it was nothing but a useless broken ring. So much did this seem to her to be so, that notwithstanding her lack of faith in matters beyond proof and knowledge, she never conceived of this passion of hers as having had a beginning, or of being capable of an end. This contradictory woman would argue against the possibility of any future existence, yet she was quite certain that her love for Godfrey had a future existence, and indeed one that was endless. When at length he put it to her that her attitude was most illogical, since that which was dead and dissolved could not exist in any place or shape, she thought for a while and replied quietly, "Then I must be wrong." "Wrong in what?" asked Godfrey. "In supposing that we do not live after death. The continuance of our love I know to be beyond any doubt, and if it involves our continuance as individual entities, well, then we continue, that is all." "We might continue as a single entity," he suggested. "Perhaps," she answered, "and if so, this would be better still, for it must be impossible to lose one another while that remained alive, comprising both." Thus, and in these few words, although she never became altogether orthodox, or took quite the same view of such mysteries as did Godfrey, Isobel made her great recantation, for which probably there would never have been any need had she been born in different surroundings, and found some other spiritual guide in youth than Mr. Knight. As the cruelties and the narrow bitterness of the world had bred unfaith in her, so did supreme love breed faith, if of an unusual sort, since she learned that without the faith her love must die, and the love she knew to be immortal. Therefore the existence of that living love presupposed all the rest, and convinced her, which in one of her obstinate nature nothing else could possibly have done. No, not if she had seen a miracle. Also this love of hers was so profound and beautiful that she felt its true origin and ultimate home must be elsewhere than on the earth. That was why she consented to be married in church, somewhat to Godfrey's surprise. In due course, having practically recovered his health, Godfrey appeared before a board in London, which passed him as fit for service, but gave him a month's leave. With this document he returned to Hawkshall, and there showed it to Isobel. "And when the month is up," she asked, looking at him, "then I suppose I shall have to join my regiment, unless they send me somewhere else." "A month is a very short time," she went on, still looking at him and turning a little pale. "Yes, dear, but lots can happen in it, as we found out in France, for instance," he added with a little hesitation. "We can get married, that is, if you wish." "You know very well, Godfrey, that I have wished it for quite 10 years. "And you know very well, Isobel, that I have wished it, well, ever since I understood what marriage was. How about to-morrow?" he exclaimed after a pause. She laughed and shook her head. "I believe, Godfrey, that some sort of licence is necessary, and it is past post time. Also it would look scarcely decent. All these people would laugh at us. Also, as there is a good deal of property concerned, I must make some arrangements." "What arrangements?" he asked. She laughed again. "That is my affair. You know I am a great supporter of woman's rights." "Oh, I see," he replied vaguely. "To keep it all free from the husband's control, etc." "Yes, Godfrey, that's it. What a business head you have. You should join the shipping firm after the war." Then they settled to be married on that day week, after which Isobel suggested that he should take up his abode at the Abbey House, where the clergyman, a bachelor, would be very glad to have him as a guest. When Godfrey inquired why, she replied blandly because his room was wanted for another patient, he being now cured, and that therefore he had no right to stop there. "Oh, I see, how selfish of me," said Godfrey, and went off to arrange matters with the clergyman. A friendly and accommodating young man, with the result that on this night once more he slept in the room he had occupied as a boy. For her part, Isobel telephoned, first to her dressmaker, and secondly to the lawyer who was winding up her father's estate, requesting these important persons to come to see her on the morrow. They came quickly, since Isobel was too valuable a client to be neglected, arriving by the same train, with the result that the lawyer was kept waiting an hour and a half by the dressmaker, a fact which he remembered in his bill. When at last his turn came, Isobel did not detain him long. "I am going to be married," she said, "on the 24th, to Major Godfrey Knight of the Indian Cavalry. Will you kindly prepare 2 documents, the first to be signed before my marriage, and the second, a will, immediately after it, since otherwise it would be invalidated by that change in my condition." The lawyer stared at her, since so much legal knowledge was not common among his lady clients, and asked for instructions as to what the documents were to set out. "They will be very simple," said Isobel. "The first, a marriage settlement, will settle half my income free of my control upon my future husband during our joint lives. The second, that is the will leave to him all my property, real and personal." "I must point out to you, Miss Blake," said the astonished lawyer, "that these provisions are very unusual. Does Major Knight bring large sums into settlement?" "I don't think so," she answered. "His means are quite moderate, and if they were not, it would never occur to him to do anything of the sort, as he understands nothing about money. Also, circumstanced as I am, it does not matter in the least." "Your late father would have taken a different view," sniffed the lawyer. "Possibly," replied Isobel, "for our views varied upon most points. While he was alive, I gave way to his, to my great loss and sorrow. Now that he is dead, I follow my own." "Well, that is definite, Miss Blake, and of course your wishes must be obeyed. But as regards this will, do not think me indelicate for mentioning it, but there might be children." "I don't think you at all indelicate. Why should I, at over 30 years of age? I have considered the point. If we are blessed with any children, and I should predecease him, my future husband will make such arrangements for their welfare as he considers wise and just. I have every confidence in his judgment, and if he should happen to die intestate, which I think very probable, they would inherit equally. There is enough for any number of them." "Unless he loses or spends it," groaned the lawyer. "He is much more likely to save it from some mistaken sense of duty, and to live entirely on what he has of his own," remarked Isobel. "If so, it cannot be helped, and no doubt the poor will benefit. Now, if you thoroughly understand what I wish done, I think that is all. I have to see the dressmaker again, so good-bye." "Executors," gasped the lawyer. "Public trustee," said Isobel, over her shoulder. "They say that she is one of these suffragette women, although she keeps it dark. Well, I can believe it. Anyway, this officer is tumbling into honey, and there's no fool like a woman in love," said the lawyer to himself as he packed his bag of papers. Isobel was quite right. The question of settlements never even occurred to Godfrey. He was aware, however, that it is usual for a bridegroom to make the bride a present, and going to London, walked miserably up and down Bond Street looking into windows until he was tired. At one moment he fixed his affections upon an old Queen Anne porringer, which his natural taste told him to be quite beautiful, but having learned from the dealer that it was meant for the mixing of infant's pap, he retired abashed. Almost next door he saw in a jeweller's window a necklace of small pearls priced at £300, and probably worth about half that amount. Having quite a handsome balance at his back, he came to the conclusion that he could afford this, and going in, bought it at once, oblivious of the fact that Isobel already had ropes of pearls the size of marrow-fat peas. However, she was delighted with it, especially when she saw what it had cost him, for he had never thought to cut the sale ticket from the necklace. It was those pearls, and not the marrow-fat peas, that Isobel wore upon her wedding day. Save for the little ring with the 2 turquoise hearts, these were her only ornament. A question arose as to where the honeymoon, or so much as would remain of one, was to be spent. Godfrey would have liked to go to Lucerne and visit the pasteur, but as this could not be managed in wartime, suggested London. "Why London?" exclaimed Isobel. "Only because most ladies like theatres, though I confess I hate them myself." "You silly man," she answered. "Do you suppose, when we can have only a few days together, that I want to waste time in theatres?" In the end it was settled that they would go to London for a night, and then on to Cornwall, which they hoped fondly might be warm at that time of year. So at last, on the 24th day of December of that fateful year 1914, they were married in the Abbey Church. Isobel's uncle, the one with whom she had stayed in Mexico, and who had retired now from the diplomatic service, gave her away, and a young cousin of hers was the sole bridesmaid, for the ceremony was of the sort called a war wedding. Her dress, however, was splendid of its kind, some rich thing of flowing broidered silk, with a veil of wondrous lace. Either from accident or by design, in general effect it much resembled that of the Plantagenet lady, which once she had copied from the brass. Perhaps being dissatisfied with her former effort, she determined to recap it on a more splendid scale, or perhaps it was a chance. At any rate, the veil, raised in 2 points from her head, fell down like that of the nameless lady, while from her elbows long narrow sleeves hung almost to the ground. Beautiful Isobel never was, but in this garb, with happiness shining in her eyes, her tall, well-made form looked imposing and even stately, an effect that was heightened by her deliberate and dignified movements. The great church was crowded, for the news of this wedding had spread far and wide, and its romantic character attracted people both from the neighbouring villages and the little town. Set in the splendid surroundings of the old abbey, through the painted windows of which gleamed the winter sun, Godfrey in his glittering Indian uniform and orders, and his bride in her quaint rich dress, made a striking pair at the altar rail. Indeed, it is doubtful whether since hundreds of years ago the old Crusader and his fair lady, whose ashes were beneath their feet, stood where they stood for this same purpose of marriage, clad in a coat of mail and gleaming silk. A nobler looking couple had been wed in that ancient fane. Oddly enough, with the strange inconsequence of the human mind, especially in moments of suppressed excitement, it was of this nameless lady and her lord that Godfrey kept thinking throughout the service, once more wondering who they were and what was their story. He remembered too often how the graves of that unknown pair had been connected with his fortunes and those of Isobel. Here it is that they plighted the troth which now they were about to fulfil. Here it was that he had bidden her farewell before he went to Switzerland. He could see her now as she was then, tall and slender in her white robe, and the red ray of sunshine gleaming like a splash of blood upon her breast. He glanced at her by his side as she turned towards him, and behold, there it shone again, splendid yet ominous. He shivered a little at the sight of it, he knew not why, and was glad when a dense black snow cloud hid the face of the sun and killed it. It was over at last, and they were man and wife. "Do these words and vows and ceremonies make any difference to you?" she whispered, as they walked side by side down the church, the observed of all observers. "They do not to me. I feel as though all the rites in the world would be quite powerless and without meaning in face of the fact of our eternal unity." It was a queer little speech for her to make, with its thought and balance. Godfrey often reflected afterwards, expressing as it did a great truth so far as they were concerned, since no ceremonial, however hallowed, could increase their existing oneness or take away therefrom. At the moment, however, he scarcely understood it, and only smiled in reply. Then they went into the vestry and signed their names, and everything was over. Here Godfrey's former trustee, General Cubitt, grown very old now, but as bustling and emphatic as of yore, who signed the book as one of the witnesses, buttonholed him. At some length he explained how he had been to see an eminent swell at the War Office, a dug-out, who was an old friend of his, and impressed upon him his, Godfrey's, extraordinary abilities as a soldier, pointing out that he ought to at once be given command of a regiment, and how the eminent swell had promised that he would see to it forthwith. Oh, if he had only known, he would not have thanked him. At last they started for the motor car, which was to drive them in pomp 300 yards to the hall. Some delay occurred. Another motor car at the church gate would not start, and had to be drawn out of the way. 3 or 4 of the nurses from the hospital and certain local ladies surrounded Isobel and burst into talk and congratulations, thus separating her from Godfrey. Overhearing complimentary remarks about himself, he drew back a little from the porch into the church, which had now emptied. As he stood there, someone tapped him on the shoulder. The touch disturbed him. It was unpleasant to him, and he turned impatiently to see from whom it came. There in front of him, bundled up in a rusty black cloak, of which the hood covered the head, was a short, fat woman. Her face was hidden, but from the cavernous recesses of the hood, 2 piercing black eyes shone like to those of a tiger in its den. After all those years, Godfrey recognised them at once. Indeed, subconsciously, he had known who had touched him, even before he turned. It was Madame Raines. "Ah," she said in her hateful remembered voice. "So my little Godfrey, who has grown such a big Godfrey now, yes, big in every way, had recognition of his dear godmamma, did he? Oh, do not deny it. I saw you jump with joy. Well, I knew what was happening. Never mind how I knew. And though I am so poor now, I travelled here to assist and give my felicitations. Eleanor, too, she sends hers, though you guess of what kind they are. For remember, as I told you long ago, spirits are just as jealous as we women, because, you see, they were women before they were spirits." "Thank you," broke in Godfrey. "I am afraid I must be going." "Oh, yes, you are in a great hurry, for now you have got the plum, my Godfrey, have you not, and want to eat it? Well, I have a message for you. Suck it hard, for very, very soon you come to the stone, which you know is sharp and cold with no taste, and must be thrown away. Oh, something make me say this too. I know not what. Perhaps that stone must be planted, not thrown away. Yes, I think it must be planted, and that it will grow into the most beautiful of plum trees in another land." She threw back her hood, showing her enormous forehead and flabby sunken face, which looked as though she had lived for years in a cellar, and yet had about it an air of inspiration. "Yes," she went on, "I see that tree white with blossom. I see it bending with the golden fruit. Thousands upon thousands of fruits. Oh, Godfrey, it is the tree of life, and underneath it sit you and that lady who looks like a queen, and whom you love so dear, and look into each other's eyes for ever and for ever, because you see that tree immortal do not grow upon the earth, my Godfrey." The horrible old woman made him afraid. Especially did her last words make him afraid, because he who was experienced in such matters knew that she had come with no intention of uttering them, that they had burst from her lips in a sudden semi-trance, such as overtakes her sisterhood from time to time. He knew what that meant, that death had marked them, and that they were called elsewhere, he or Isobel, or both. "I must be going," he repeated. "Yes, yes, you must be going, you who are going so far. The hungry fish must go after the bait, must it not? And oh, the hook it does not see. But my little big Godfrey, one moment. Your loving old godmamma. She tumble on the evil day ever since that cursed old pasteur. Here her pale face twisted, and her eyes grew wicked. Let loose the law dogs on me. I want money, my godson. Here is an address, and she thrust a piece of paper upon him. He threw it down and stamped on it. In his pocket was a leather case full of banknotes. He drew out a handful of them and held them to her. She snatched them as a hungry hawk snatches meat, with a fierce and curious swiftness. Then at last he escaped, and in another minute, amidst the cheers of the crowd, was driving away at the side of the stately Isobel. At the hall, where one of the wards had been cleared for the purpose, there was a little informal reception, at which for a while Godfrey found himself officiating alone, since Isobel had disappeared with General Cubitt and the brother officer who had acted as his best man. When at length they returned, he asked her where she had been, rather sharply perhaps, for his nerves were on edge. To see to some business with the lawyer, she answered. What business, dear? He inquired. I thought you settled all that this morning. It could not be settled this morning, Godfrey, because a will can only be signed after marriage. Good gracious, he exclaimed. Give me a glass of champagne. An hour later they were motoring to London alone, at last alone, and to this pair heaven opened its seventh door. They dined in the private sitting-room of the suite, which under the inspiration of Isobel he had taken at a London hotel, and then after the curious-eyed waiters had cleared the table, sat together in front of the fire, hand in hand, but not talking very much. At length Isobel rose, and they embraced each other. I am going to bed now, she said, but before you come, and perhaps we forget about such matters, I want you to kneel down with me and say a prayer. He obeyed as a child might, though wondering, for somehow he had never connected Isobel and prayer in his mind. There they knelt in front of the fire, as reverently as though it burned upon an altar, and Isobel said her prayer aloud. It ran thus: O unknown God, whom always I have sought, and whom now I think that I have found, or am near to finding, O power that sent me forth to taste of life and gather knowledge, and who at thine own hour wilt call me back again, hear the prayer of Isobel and of Godfrey her lover. This is what they ask of thee, that be their time together on earth long or short, it may endure for ever in the lives and lands beyond the earth. They ask also that all their sins, known and unknown, great or small, may be forgiven them, and that with thy gifts they may do good, and that if children come to them, they may be blessed in such fashion as thou seest well, and afterwards endure with them through all the existences to be. O giver of life and love eternal, hear this, the solemn marriage prayer of Godfrey and of Isobel. Then she rose, and with one long look left him, seeming to his eyes no more a woman, as 10,000 women are, but a very fire of spiritual love incarnate in a veil of flesh. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Love Eternal by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michele Eaton. Orders. Godfrey and his wife never went to Cornwall after all, for on Christmas Day the weather turned so bad and travelling was so difficult that they determined to stop where they were for a few days. As for them, the roof of this London hotel had become synonymous with that of the crystal dome of heaven. This did not matter in the least. There they sat in their hideous, over-gilded private sitting-room, or when the weather was clear enough went for walks in the park, and once to the South Kensington Museum, where they enjoyed themselves very thoroughly. It was on the 4th morning after their marriage that the blow fell. Godfrey had walked early, and lay watching his wife at his side. The grey light from the uncurtained window, which they had opened to air the overheated room, revealed her in outline but not in detail, and made her fine face mysterious, framed as it was in her yellow hair. He watched it with a kind of rapture, till at length she sighed and stirred, then began to murmur in her sleep. "My darling," she whispered, "oh, my darling, how have I lived without you? Well, that is over, since alive or dead we can never be parted more. Not really, not really." Then she opened her grey eyes and stretched out her arms to receive him, and he was glad, for he seemed to be listening to that which he was not meant to hear. A little later there came a knocking at the door, and a page boy's squeaky voice without said, "Telegram for you, sir." Godfrey called to him to put it down, but Isobel turned pale and shivered. "Who can it be?" she said, clasping him. "No one knows our address." "Oh, yes, they do," he answered. "You forget you telephoned to the hall yesterday afternoon about the hospital business you had forgotten, and gave our number, which would be quite enough." "So I did, like a fool," she exclaimed, looking as though she were going to cry. "Don't be frightened, dear," he said. "I dare say it is nothing. You see we have no one to lose." No, I feel sure it is a great deal, and we have each other. Read it quickly and get the thing over." So he rose and fetched the yellow envelope which reposed upon Isobel's boots outside the door. A glance showed him that it was marked official, and then his heart too began to sink. Returning to the bed, he switched on the electric light and opened the envelope. "There's enough of it," he said, drawing out 3 closely written sheets. Read it," answered Isobel. So he read. It was indeed a very long telegram, one of such as are commonly sent at the expense of the country, and it came from the War Office. The gist of it was that attempts had been made to communicate with him at an address he had given in Cornwall, but the messages had been returned, and finally inquiry at Hawks Hall had given a clue. He was directed to report himself early tomorrow (the telegram had been sent off on the previous night) to take up an appointment which would be explained to him. There was, it added, no time to lose, as the ship was due to sail within 24 hours. "There," said Isobel, "I knew it was something of the sort. This," she added with a flash of inspiration, "is the result of the meddling of that old General Cubitt. You see, it must be a distant appointment, or they would not talk about the ship being due to sail." "I dare say," he answered as cheerfully as he could. "Such things are to be expected in these times, are they not?" "Too bad," she went on. "At any rate they might have let you have your leave." Then they rose because they must, and made pretence to eat some breakfast, after which they departed in one of Isobel's motors, which had been summoned by telephone from her London house to the department indicated in the telegram. They need not have hurried, since the important person whom Godfrey must see did not arrive for a full hour, during all which time Isobel sat waiting in the motor. However, when he appeared, he was very gracious. "Oh yes," he said, "you are Major Knight, and we have a mutual friend in old General Cubitt. In fact, it was he who put an idea into our heads, for which, as I understand, you are just married. A pretty hunt you gave us, by the way. Perhaps you won't altogether bless him, since otherwise, as you are only just recovered from your wounds, I have no doubt we could have given you a month or 2 extra leave. However, I know you are very keen, for I've looked up your record, and private affairs must give way, mustn't they? Also, as it happens, Mrs. Knight need not be anxious, as we are not going to send you into any particular danger. I dare say you won't see a shot fired. Look here, Major, you have been a staff officer, haven't you? And it is reported of you that you always got on extremely well with natives, and especially in some semi-political billets, which you have held when you had to negotiate with their chiefs. Well, to cut it short, a man of the kind is wanted in East Africa, coming out direct from home with military authority. He will have to keep in touch with the big chiefs in our own territory, and arrange for them to supply men for working or fighting, etc., and if possible, open negotiations with those in German territory and win them over to us. Further, as you know, there are an enormous number of Indians settled in East Africa with whom you would be particularly qualified to deal. We should look to you to make the most of these in any way required. You see, the appointment is a special one, and if the work be well done, as I have no doubt it will be, I am also sure, he added significantly, that the results to the officer concerned will be special also. Now, I don't ask you if you decline the appointment, because we are certain in time of war you will not do so, and I think that's all, except that you will be accredited ostensibly to the staff of the General in command in East Africa, and also receive private instructions, of which the General and the local governments will have copies. Now, do you understand everything, especially that your powers will be very wide, and that you will have to act largely on your own discretion? I think so, sir, said Godfrey, concealing the complete confusion of his mind as well as he was able. At any rate, I shall pick things up as I go along. Yes, that's the right spirit. Pick things up as you go on, as we are all doing in this war. I have to pick 'em up, I can tell you, and now I won't keep you any longer, for you see you'll have to hustle. I believe a special boat for East Africa, with stores, etc., sails tomorrow morning, so you'll have to take the last train to Southampton. An officer will meet you at Waterloo with your instructions, and if he misses you, you will go on down to the boat. Also you will have details of your pay and allowances, which will be liberal, though I am told you are not likely to want money in future. So good-bye and good luck to you. You must report officially through the General or the local governors, but you will also be able to write privately to us. Indeed, please remember that we shall expect you to do so. So Godfrey went, but as he neared the door the big man called after him, "By the way, I forgot to congratulate you." No, I don't mean on your marriage, but on your promotion. You've been informed, haven't you? Well, it will be gazetted tomorrow or in a day or two, and letters will be sent to you with the other papers." "What promotion?" asked Godfrey. "Oh, to be a colonel, of course. You did very well out there in France, you know, and it is thought advisable that the officer undertaking this special work should have a colonel's rank, just to begin with. Good-bye." So Godfrey went, and said vaguely to the waiting Isobel, "I'm afraid, dear, that I shall have to ask you to help me do some shopping. I think there are some stores near here. We had better drive to them." "Tell me everything," said Isobel. So he told her, and when he had finished she said slowly, "It is bad enough, but I suppose it might be worse. Will they let me go with you to Southampton?" "I expect so," he answered. "At any rate, we will try it on. I think it is an ordinary train, and you have a right to take a ticket." Then they shopped. All day they shopped, with the result, since money can do much, that when they reached Waterloo, his baggage containing everything needful, or at least nearly everything, was already waiting for him. So was the messenger with the promised papers, including a formal communication notifying to him that he was now a lieutenant colonel. "And to think that they have painted Major on those tin cases," said Isobel regretfully, for no objection had been raised to her accompanying Godfrey, with whom she was seated in a reserved carriage. They reached Southampton about midnight, and on Godfrey presenting himself and asking when the boat sailed, he was informed that it was uncertain, but probably within the next week. Then, remembering all he had gone through that day, he swore as a man will. But Isobel rejoiced inwardly. Oh, how she rejoiced, though all she said was that it would give him time to complete his shopping. Save for the advancing shadow of separation and a constant stream of telegrams and telephone messages to and from his chiefs in London, which occupied many of the hours, these were very happy days, especially as in the end they spread themselves out to the original limit of his leave. "At least we have not been cheated," said Isobel, when at last they stood together on the deck of the ship, waiting for the second bell to ring. And others are worse off. I believe those two poor people, and she pointed to a young officer and his childlike bride, were only married yesterday. The scene on the ship was dreary, for many were going in her to the various theatres of war, Egypt, Africa, and other places. And sad, oh sad were the goodbyes upon that bitter winter afternoon. Some of the women cried, especially those of the humbler class, but Isobel would not cry. She remained quite calm to the last, arranging a few flowers and unpacking a travelling bag in Godfrey's cabin, for as a colonel he had one to himself. Then the second bell rang, and to the ears upon which its strident clamour fell, the trump of doom could not have been more awful. "Good-bye, my darling," she said. "Good-bye, and remember what I have told you, that near or far, living or dead, we can never really be apart again, for ours is the love eternal given to us in the beginning." "Yes," he answered briefly, "I know that it is so, and enduring for ever. God bless us both as he sees best." The ship cast off, and Isobel stood in the evening light, watching from the quay, till Godfrey vanished and the vessel which bore him was swallowed up in the shadows. Then she went back to the hotel, and throwing herself upon that widowed bed, kissed the place where his head had lain, and wept. Ah, how she wept! For her joy days were done, and her heart was breaking in her. After this, Isobel took a night train back to town, and returning to Hawks Hall, threw herself with the energy that was remarkable in her into the management of her hospital and many another work and charity connected with the war, for it was only in work that she could forget herself and her aching loneliness. Godfrey had a comfortable and prosperous voyage, since it was almost before the days of submarines, at any rate so far as passenger steamers were concerned, and they saw no enemy ships. Therefore, within little more than a month, he landed on the hot shores of Mombasa, and could cable to Isobel that he was safe and well, and receive her loving answer. The next business was to report himself in the proper quarter, which he did. Those over him seemed quite bewildered as to what he had come for or what he was to do, and could only suggest that he should travel to Nairobi and Uganda and put himself in touch with the civil authorities. This he did also, and as a result formulated a certain scheme of action, to which his military superiors assented, intimating that he might do as he liked, so long as he did not interfere with them. What happened to him may be very briefly described. In the end, he started to visit a great chief on the borders of German East Africa, but in British territory, a man whose loyalty was rumoured to be doubtful. This chief, Jagga by name, was a professed Christian, and at his town there lived a missionary of the name of Taffalet, who had built a church there and was said to have much influence over him. So with the Reverend Mr. Taffalet, Godfrey communicated by runners, saying that he was coming to visit him. Accordingly he started with a guard of native troops, a coloured interpreter and some servants, but without any white companion, since the attack on German territory was beginning and no one could be spared to go with him upon a diplomatic mission. The journey was long and arduous, involving many days of marching across the East African veld and through its forests, where game of all sorts was extraordinarily plentiful, and at night they were surrounded by lions. At length, however, with the exception of one man who remained with the lions, they arrived safely at the town of Jagga, and were met by Mr. Taffalet, who took Godfrey into his house, a neat thatched building with a wide verandah that stood by the church, which was a kind of whitewashed shed, also thatched. Mr. Taffalet proved to be a clergyman of good birth and standing, one of those earnest, saint-like souls who follow literally the scriptural injunction and abandon all to advance the cause of their Master in the dark places of the earth. A tall, thin, nervous-looking man of not much over 30 years of age, one, too, possessed of considerable private means. He had some 5 years before given up a good living in England in order to obey what he considered to be his call. Being sent to this outlying post, he found it in a condition of the most complete savagery, and worked as few have done. He built the church with native labour, furnishing it beautifully inside, mostly at his own expense. He learned the local languages. He started a school. He combated the witch doctors and medicine men. Finally, he met with his reward in the conversion of the young chief Jagga, which was followed by that of a considerable portion of his people. But here came the trouble. The bulk of the tribe, which was large and powerful, did not share the chief's views. For instance, his uncle, Alulu, the head rainmaker and witch doctor, differed from them very emphatically. He was shrewd enough to see that the triumph of Christianity meant his destruction, also the abandonment of all their ancient customs. He harangued the tribe in secret, asking them if they wished to bring upon themselves the vengeance of their ancestral and other spirits, and to go through days as the possessors of only one miserable wife. Questions to which they answered that emphatically they did not. So the tribe was rent in two, and by far the smaller half clung to Jagga, to whom the dim, turbulent heathen thousands beneath his rule rendered but a lip service. Then came the war, and Alulu and his great following saw their opportunity. Why should they not be rid of Jagga and the Christian teacher with his newfangled notions? If it could be done in no other way, why should they not move across the border, which was close by, into German territory? The Germans, at any rate, would not bother them about such matters. Under their rule they might live as their forefathers had done from the beginning, and have as many wives as they chose, without being called all sorts of ugly names. This was the position when Godfrey arrived. His coming made a great sensation. He was reported to be a very big lord indeed, as big or bigger than the king's governor himself. Alulu put it about that he had come to make a soldier of every fit man, and to enslave the women and the elders to work on the roads or in dragging guns. The place seethed with secret ferment. Mr. Taffolet knew something of all this through Jagga, who was genuinely frightened, and communicated it to Godfrey. In the result, a meeting of all the headmen was held, which was attended by thousands of the people. Godfrey spoke through his interpreter, saying that in this great war the King of England required their help, and generally set out the objects of his mission, remarks that were received in respectful silence. Then Alulu spoke, devoting himself chiefly to an attack upon the Christian faith, and on the interference of the white teacher with their customs, that he observed had resulted in their ancestral spirits cursing them with the worst drought they had experienced for years, which in the circumstances he, Alulu, could and would do nothing to alleviate. How could they fight and work for the great king when their stomachs were pinched with hunger, owing to the witchcraft and magical rites which the white teacher celebrated in the church? How indeed, shouted the heathen section, although in fact their season had been very good, while the Christians, feeling themselves in a minority, were silent. Then the chief Jagga spoke. He traversed all the arguments of Alulu, whom he denounced in no measured terms, saying that he was plotting against him. Finally he came down heavily on the side of the British, remarking that he knew who were the would-be traitors, and that they should suffer in due course. It has been whispered in my ears, he concluded, that there is a plot afoot against my friend the white teacher, who has done us all so much good. It has even been whispered that there are those, here he looked hard at Alulu, who have declared that it would be well to kill this great white lord who is our guest. And he pointed to Godfrey with his little chief's staff, so that he may not return to tell who are the true traitors among the people of Jagga. I say to you who have thought such things, that this Lord is the greatest of all lords, and as well might you lay hands on our father, the mighty King of England himself, as upon this his friend and counsellor. If a drop of his blood is shed, then surely the king's armies will come, and we shall die, every one of us, the innocent and the guilty together, for terrible will be the vengeance of the king. This outburst made a great impression, for all the multitude cried, "It is so, we know that it is so," and Lulu interposed that he would as soon think of murdering his own mother, who Mr. Taffolet whispered to Godfrey had been dead these many years, as of touching a hair of the great white chief's head. On the contrary, it was their desire to do everything that he ordered them, but concerning the matter of the new custom of having one wife only, etc. This brought Mr. Taffolet to his feet, for on monogamy he was especially strong, and the meeting ended on a theological discussion which nearly resulted in blows between the factions. Finally it was adjourned for a week, when it was arranged that an answer should be given to Godfrey's demands. 3 nights later an answer was given, and one of a terrible sort. Shortly after sundown, Godfrey was sitting in the missionary's house writing a report. Mr. Taffolet, it being Sunday, was holding an evening service in the church, at which Jarger and most of the Christians were present. Suddenly a tumult arose, and the air was rent with savage shouts and shrieks. Godfrey sprang up and snatched his revolver, just as some of his servants arrived and announced that the people in the church were being killed. Acting on his first impulse, he ran to the place, calling to his guard to follow him, which they did so tardily that he entered it alone. Here a sight of horror met his eyes. The building was full of dead and dying people. By the altar, dressed in his savage witch-doctor's gear, stood Lulu, a lamp in his hand, with which evidently he had been firing the church, for tongues of flame ran up the walls. On the altar itself was something that had a white cloth thrown over it, as do the sacred vessels. Catching sight of Godfrey, with a yell, the brute tore away the napkin, revealing the severed head of Mr. Taffolet, whose surplice-draped body Godfrey now distinguished lying in the shadows on one side of the altar. "Here is the white medicine man's magic wine," he screamed, pointing to the blood that ran down the broidered frontal. "Come drink, come drink." Godfrey ran forward up the church, his pistol in his hand. When he reached the chancel, he stopped and fired at the mouthing, bedizened devil who was dancing hideously in front of the altar. The heavy service revolver bullet struck him in some mortal place, for he leapt into the air, grabbed at the altar cloth, and fell to the ground. There he lay still, covered by the cloth, with the massive brass crucifix resting face downwards on his breast, and the murdered man's head lying at his side, as though it were looking at him. This was the last sight that Godfrey saw for many a day, for just then a spear pierced his breast. Also something struck him on the temple. A curious recollection rose in his mind of the head of a mummy after the pasteur had broken it off, rolling along the floor in the flat at Lucerne. Then he thought he heard Madame Raines laughing, after which he remembered no more. It might have been 1,000 years, or it might have been a minute, for he had passed into a state that takes no reck of time. Godfrey began to dream. He dreamed that he was travelling, that he was in a house, and then a long while afterwards that he was making a journey by sea. Another vacuum of nothingness, and he dreamed again, this time very vividly. Now his dream was that he had come to Egypt and was stretched on a bed in a room, through the windows of which he could see the pyramids quite close at hand. More, he seemed to become acquainted with all their history. He saw them in the building, multitudes of brown men dragging huge blocks of stone up a slope of sand. He saw them finished one by one, and all the ceremonies of the worship with which they were connected. Dead pharaohs were laid to rest there beneath his eyes. Living pharaohs prayed within their chapels and made oblation to the spirits of those who had gone before them, while ever the white-robed shaven priests chanted in his ears. Then all passed, and he saw them mighty as ever, but deserted, standing there in the desert, the monuments of a forgotten greatness, till at length a new people came and stripped off their marble coverings. These things he remembered afterwards, but there were many more that he forgot. Again Godfrey dreamed, a strange and beautiful dream which went on from day to day. It was that he was very ill, and that Isobel had come to nurse him. She came quite suddenly, and at first seemed a little frightened and disturbed, but afterwards very happy indeed. This went on for a while, till suddenly there struck him a sense of something terrible that had happened, of an upheaval of conditions, of a wrenching asunder of ties, of change utter and profound. Then, while he mourned because she was not there, Isobel came again, but different. The difference was indefinable, but it was undoubted. Her appearance seemed to have changed somewhat, and in the intervals between her comings he could never remember how she had been clothed, except for two things which she always seemed to wear: the little ring with the turquoise hearts, though oddly enough not her wedding ring, and the string of small pearls which he had given her when they married, and knew again by the clasp that was fashioned in a lover's knot of gold. Her voice too seemed changed, or rather he did not hear her voice, since it appeared to speak within him, in his consciousness, not without to his ears. She told him all sorts of strange things, about a wonderful land in which they would live together, and the home that she was making ready for him, and the trees and flowers growing round it, that were unlike any of which Godfrey had ever heard. Also she said that there were not many other matters whereof she would wish to speak to him, only she might not. Finally there came a vivid dream, in which she told him that soon he would wake up to the world again for a little while. She seemed to lay emphasis on this little while, and if he could not find her in it, then he must not grieve at all, since although their case seemed sad, it was much better than he could conceive. In his dream she made him promise that he would not grieve, and he did so, wondering. At this she smiled, looking more beautiful than ever he could have conceived her to be. Then she spoke these words, always, as it appeared, within him, printing them, as it were, upon his mind. Now you are about to wake up, and I must leave you for a while. But this I promise you, my most dear, my beloved, my own, that before you fall asleep again for the last time, you shall see me once more, for that is allowed to me. Indeed, it shall be I who will soothe you to sleep, and I who will receive you when you awake again. Also in the space between, although you do not see me, you will always feel me near, and I shall be with you. So swear to me once more that you will not grieve. Then in his vision Godfrey swore, and she appeared to lean over him and whisper words into his ear, that although they impressed themselves upon his brain, as the others had done, had no meaning for him, since they were in some language which he did not understand. Only he knew that they conveyed a blessing to him, and not that of Isobel alone. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Love Eternal by H. Rider Haggard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Michele Eaton. Love Eternal. Godfrey awoke and looked about him. He was lying in a small room opposite to an open window that had thin gauze shutters, which as an old Indian he knew at once were to keep out mosquitoes. Through his window he could see the mighty towering shapes of the pyramids, and reflected that after all there must have been some truth in those wonderful dreams. He lifted his hand. It was so thin that the strong sunlight shone through it. He touched his head and felt that it was wrapped in bandages, also that it seemed benumbed upon one side. A little dark woman wearing a nurse's uniform entered the room, and he asked her where he was, as once before he had done in France, and under very similar conditions. She stared and answered with an Irish accent, "Where else but at Menor House Hospital? Don't the pyramids tell you that?" "I thought so," he replied. "How long have I been here?" "Oh, 2 months or more. I can't tell you, Colonel, unless I look at the books, with so many sick men coming and going. Sure, it's a pleasure to see you yourself again. We thought that perhaps you'd never wake up reasonably." "Did you? I always knew that I should." "And how did you know that?" "Because someone I'm very fond of came and told me so." She glanced at him sharply. "Then it's myself that should be flattered," she answered, "or the night nurse, seeing that it is we who have cared for you with no visitors admitted except the doctors, and they didn't talk that way. Now, Colonel, just you drink this and have a nap, for you mustn't speak too much all at once. If you keep wagging your jaw, you'll upset the bandages." When he woke again it was night, and now the full moon, such a moon as one sees in Egypt, shone upon the side of the great pyramid and made it silver. He could hear voices talking outside his door. One, that of the Irish nurse, which he recognised, and the other of a man, for although they spoke low, this sense of hearing seemed to be peculiarly acute to him. "It is so, Major," said the nurse. "I tell you that except for a little matter about someone he thought had been visiting him, he is as reasonable as I am, and much more than you are, saving your presence." "Well," answered the doctor, "as you speak the truth sometimes, sister, I'm inclined to believe you, but all I have to say is that I could have staked my professional reputation that the poor chap would never get his wits again. He has had an awful blow, and on the top of an old wound too. After all these months, it's strange, very strange, and I hope it will continue." "Well, of course, Major, there is the delusion about the lady." "Lady? How do you know it was a lady? Just like a woman making up a romance out of nothing." "Yes, there's the delusion, which is bad. Keep his mind off it as much as possible, and tell him some of your own in your best brogue. I'll come and examine him to-morrow morning." Then the voices died away, and Godfrey almost laughed because they had talked of his delusion, when he knew so well that it was none. Isobel had been with him. Yes, although he could neither hear nor see her, Isobel was with him now, for he felt her presence. And yet how could this be if he was in Egypt and she was in England? So wondering, he fell asleep again. By degrees, as he gathered strength, Godfrey learned all the story of what had happened to him, or rather so much of it as those in charge of the hospital knew. It appeared, according to Sister Elizabeth, as his nurse was named, that when he was struck down in the church, somewhere in Africa, as she said vaguely, the guards whom he had with him rushed in, firing on the native murderers, who fled away except those who were killed. Believing that, with the missionary, they had murdered the king's officer, a great man, they fled fast and far into German East Africa, and were no more seen. The chief Jaga, who had escaped, caused him to be carried out of the burning church to the missionary's house, and sent runners to the nearest magistrate many miles away, where there was a doctor. So there he lay in the house. A native servant who once acted as a hospital orderly had washed his wounds and bound them up. One of these, that on the head, was caused by a kerry or some blunt instrument, and the other was a spear stab in the lung. Also from time to time this servant poured milk down his throat. At length the doctor came with an armed escort, and greatly daring, performed some operation which relieved the pressure on the brain and saved his life. In that house he lay for a month or more, and then in a semi-comatose condition was carried by slow stages in a litter back to Mombasa. Here he lay another month or so, and as his mind showed no signs of returning, was at length put on board a ship and brought to Egypt. Meanwhile, as Godfrey learned afterwards, he was believed to have been murdered with the missionary, and a report to that effect was sent to England, which in the general muddle that prevailed at the beginning of the war had never been corrected. For be it remembered, it was not until he was carried to Mombasa, nearly 2 months after he was hurt, that he reached any place where there was a telegraph. By this time also, those at Mombasa had plenty of fresh casualties to report, and indeed were not aware, or had forgotten what exact story had been sent home concerning Godfrey, who could not speak for himself. So it came about through a series of mischances that at home he was believed to be dead, as happened to many other men in the course of the Great War. After he came to himself at the Manor House Hospital, Godfrey inquired whether there were not some letters for him, but none could be found. He had arranged with the only person likely to write to him, namely Isobel, to do so through the War Office, and evidently that plan had not succeeded, for her letters had gone astray. The truth was, of course, that some had been lost, and after definite news of his death was received, the rest had not been forwarded. Now he bethought him that he would cable home to Isobel to tell her that he was recovering, though somehow he imagined that she would know this already through the authorities. With great difficulty, for the hurt to his side made it hard for him to use his arm, he wrote the telegram and gave it to Sister Elizabeth to send, remarking that he would pay the cost as soon as he could draw some money. "That won't matter," she replied as she took the cable. Then with an odd look at him, she went away as though to arrange for its dispatch. After she had gone, 2 orderlies helped Godfrey downstairs to sit on the broad veranda of the hospital. Here still stood many of the little tables which used to serve for pleasant tea parties when the building was an hotel in the days before the war. On these lay some old English newspapers. Godfrey picked up one of them with his left hand and began to read idly enough. Almost the first paragraph that his eye fell on was headed, "Heroic Death of a V.A.D. Commandant." Something made him read on quickly, and this is what he saw. At the inquest on the late Mrs. Knight, the wife of Colonel Knight, who was reported murdered by natives in East Africa some little time ago, some interesting evidence was given. It appeared from the testimony of Mrs. Parsons, a nurse in the Hawkshaw Hospital, that when warning was given of the approach of Zeppelins during last week's raid on the eastern counties and London, the patients in the upper rooms of the hospital were removed to its lower floors. Finding that one young man, a private in the Suffolk regiment, who has lost both his feet, had been overlooked, Mrs. Knight, followed by Mrs. Parsons, went upstairs to help him down. When Mrs. Parsons, whom she outran, reached the door of the ward, there was a great explosion, apparently on the roof. She waited till the dust had cleared off, and groped her way down the ward with the help of an electric torch. Reaching Private Thompson's bed, she saw lying on it Mrs. Knight, who had been killed by the fallen masonry. Private Thompson, who was unhurt beneath the body, said that when the bricks began to come down, Mrs. Knight called to him to lie still, and threw herself on him to protect him. Then something heavy, he believed the stone coping of a chimney, fell on her back, and she uttered one word. He thought it was a name, and was silent. Mrs. Knight, who was the only child of the late Sir John Blake Bart, the well-known ship-owner, is said to have been one of the richest women in England. She married the late Colonel Knight some months ago, immediately before he was sent to East Africa. Under the provisions of her will, the cremated remains of Mrs. Knight will be interred in the chancel of the Abbey Church at Monk's Acre. Godfrey read this awful paragraph twice, and looked at the date of the paper. It was nearly 2 months old. So she was dead when she came to me. Oh, now I understand, he muttered to himself, and then, had not a passing native servant caught him, he would have fallen to the ground. It was one of the 10,000 minor tragedies of the World War, that is all. 3 months later, still very crippled and coughing badly because of the injury to his lung, he reported himself in London, and once more saw the Under-Secretary who had sent him out to East Africa. There he sat in the same room, at the same desk, looking precisely the same. "I am sorry, sir, that my mission has failed through circumstances beyond my control. I can only add that I did my best," he said briefly. "I know," answered the official. "It was no fault of yours if those black brutes tried to murder you. Everything goes wrong in that cursed East Africa. Now go home and get yourself fit again, my dear fellow," he went on very kindly, adding, "your services will not be overlooked." "I have no home, and I shall never be fit again," replied Godfrey, and left the room. "I forgot," thought the Under-Secretary. "His wife was killed in a Zeppelin raid. Odd that she should have been taken, and he left." Then, with a sigh and a shrug of the shoulders, he turned to his business. Godfrey went to the little house at Hampstead, where he used to live while he was studying as a lad, for here Mrs. Parsons was waiting for him. Then for the first time he gave way, and they wept in each other's arms. "We were too happy, nurse," he said. "Yes," she answered. "Love like hers wasn't for this world, and more than once she said to me that she never expected to see you again in the flesh, though I thought she meant it was you who would go, as might have been expected. Stop, I have something for you." Going to the desk, she produced from it a ring, that with the turquoise hearts, also a canvas-covered diary. "That's her diary," she said. "She used to write in it every day." That night Godfrey read many beautiful and sacred things in this diary. From it he learned that the shock of his supposed death had caused Isobel to miscarry and made her ill for some time, though underneath the entries about her illness and the false news of his death she had written, "He is not dead. I know that he is not dead." Afterwards there were some curious sentences in which she spoke joyfully of having seen him in her sleep, ill but living and going to recover, at any rate for a while, she had added. On the very day of her death she had made this curious note: "I feel as though Godfrey and I were about to be separated for a while, and yet that this separation will really bring us closer together. I am strangely happy. Great vistas seem to open to my soul, and down them I walk with Godfrey for ever and a day, and over them broods the love of God, in which are embodied and expressed all other loves. Oh, how wrong and foolish was I, who for so many years rejected that love, which yet will not be turned away, and in mercy gave me sight and wisdom, and with these, Godfrey, from whose soul my soul can never more be parted. For as I told you, my darling, ours is the love eternal. Remember it always, Godfrey, if ever your eyes should see these words upon the earth. Afterwards there will be no need for memory." So the diary ended. They invalided Godfrey out of the service, and because of his lung trouble he went to the house that Miss Ogilvy had left him in Lucerne, taking Mrs. Parsons with him. There too he found the pasteur, grown an old man, but otherwise much the same as ever, and him also he brought to live in the Villa Ogilvy. The winter went on, and Godfrey grew not better but worse, till at last he knew that he was dying, and rejoiced to die. One evening a letter was brought to him. It was from Madame Raines, written in a shaky hand, and ran thus: "I am going to pass to the world of spirits, and so are you, my Godfrey, for I know all about you and everything that has happened. The plum is eaten, but the stone, it is growing already, and soon you will be sitting with another under the beautiful tree of life of which I told you in the English church. And I, where shall I be sitting? I do not know, but there is this difference between us, that whereas I am afraid, you have no cause for fear. You rejoice, yes, and shall rejoice, for though sometimes I hate you, I must tell it. Yet I am sorry if I have harmed you, and should you be able, I pray you, say a good word in the world of spirits, for your sinful old godmamma reigns. So fare you well, who thinking that you have lost, have gained all. It is I who have lost. Again farewell, and bid that old pasteur to pray for me, which he who is good will do, although I was his enemy and cursed him. See that she lacks for nothing till the end, and comfort her if you can, said Godfrey to the pasteur. That night a shape of glory seemed to stand by Godfrey's bed, and to whisper wonderful things into his ears. He saw it, clearly, and knew that in forming its changeful loveliness was all which had been Isobel upon the earth. Fear nothing, he thought it said, for I am with you and others greater than I. Know, Godfrey, that everything has a meaning, and that all joy must be won through pain. Our lives seem to have been short and sad, but these are not the real life. They are but its black and ugly door, whereof the threshold must be watered with our tears, and the locks turned by the winds of faith and prayer. Do not be afraid then of the blackness of the passage, for beyond it shines the immortal light in that land where there is understanding and all forgiveness. Therefore be glad, Godfrey, for the night of sorrows is at an end, and the dawn breaks of peace that passes understanding. Godfrey woke and spoke to the old pasteur, who was watching by his bed while Mrs. Parsons wept at its foot. Did you see anything? He asked. No, my son, he answered, but I felt something. It was though an angel stood at my side. Then Godfrey told him all his vision, and much else besides, of which before he had never spoken to living man. It may well be, my son, answered the pasteur, since to those who have suffered greatly, the good God gives the great reward. He who endured pain can understand our pains, and he who redeemed sin can understand and be gentle to our sins, for his is the true love eternal. So go forward with faith and gladness, and in the joy of that new world, and of the lost which is found again, think sometimes of the old pasteur, who hopes soon to join you there. Then he shrove and blessed him. After this, Godfrey slept a while to wake elsewhere, in the land of that love eternal, which the soul of Isobel foreknew. End of chapter 21. End of Love Eternal by H. Rider Haggard.